April 1943. Dawn broke over the English countryside like a slow bruise spreading across the horizon. The airfield lay silent except for the wind that moved through the empty hangars, carrying with it the sharp scent of oil, cold iron, and burned aviation fuel. Frost clung to every surface metal, canvas, glass, turning the bombers into hulking silhouettes of silver ghosts. Arthur Hale stood alone beside one of them, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. The engines were quiet now, but he could still hear their echo. The sputter, the cough, the sudden death of power that had sent another crew spiraling into the black. 24 hours ago they'd been alive, laughing over tin mugs of tea. Now they were just names written in pencil on a clipboard that would be filed away and forgotten. He'd seen too many clipboards that winter. No one could explain why it kept happening. Perfectly healthy engines freezing mid-flight, cutting out without warning, leaving pilots gliding helplessly into German territory. The official reports called it mechanical failure. But Hale didn't believe in ghosts made of metal. He believed in patterns, and something in the pattern was wrong. The dawn wind shifted, carrying the far-off rumble of trucks on the supply road. Mechanics moved through the fog, their footsteps crunching on gravel. A young corporal passed Hale with a quick salute, eyes red from lack of sleep. "Another one didn't make it back, sir," he murmured. Hale only nodded. There were no words left for that kind of news. He turned toward the hangar, boots sinking slightly in the mud. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of solvent and sweat. Tools lay scattered on the workbenches, alongside half-eaten sandwiches and coffee gone cold hours ago. Somewhere in the shadows, a radio played faintly. Benny Goodman, distorted by static. It was the only sound that reminded them there was still a world outside this place. Hale rolled up his sleeves and ran his hand along the cold curve of an engine cowling. The surface was slick with condensation. He could feel the story of the night in its texture. The heat that once lived inside it now drained away. He crouched to inspect the fuel lines, tracing the thin copper tubing with his fingers. Everything looked fine. Every test, every inspection, every report said the same thing. The engines were perfect, but the sky didn't care about perfection. The sky froze men all the same. He stood again, his breath forming clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Somewhere above those clouds, thousands of feet up, the temperature could drop to 50 degrees below freezing. Hale had flown once, early in the war. He remembered the feeling of air turning to glass, of metal groaning like it was alive. He had felt the cold creep in, slow and invisible, and now he suspected that same cold was killing his engines. But how? The fuel should have been protected. Every system designed to keep flow constant. Yet every report told the same story, engines dying at altitude, always after an hour or two in the air. Always when the mission reached the edge of Germany. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't luck. It was something elemental. He reached for his logbook and flipped through the pages. Dozens of sketches, numbers, pressure readings. They told him what the machines couldn't say out loud. The temperature dropped, viscosity changed, pressure faltered. Somewhere between theory and reality, the fuel froze. A distant siren wailed, breaking the stillness. Another flight crew returning from a failed run. Hale closed the book and rubbed his eyes. Outside, the sun finally pierced the fog, casting a pale, colourless light across the airfield. It made everything look fragile. The planes, the men, even the air itself. He walked to the open hangar doors and watched as the trucks rolled past, carrying crates of ammunition and barrels of fuel. Each one was a reminder of what kept this place alive. And what could so easily destroy it? Colonel Briggs appeared beside him, coat buttoned to the neck, his voice sharp. "They're grounding the 409th Squadron until further notice," he said. "Command thinks the pilots are cutting throttle too hard in the cold." Hale turned, his brow tightening. "It's not the pilots, sir," Briggs sighed, exhaling smoke from his cigarette. "You've said that before, and I'll keep saying it until someone listens." Briggs studied him for a long moment. "You're a good engineer, Arthur, but this isn't a university lab. We're fighting a war. If the brass says pilot error, that's what goes in the report." The colonel dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Get some rest. You look half dead." But rest wasn't what Hale needed. He needed answers. That night, the base fell into silence again. Only the wind moving through empty hangars and the rhythmic ticking of a distant clock. Hale sat at his workbench, the small bulb overhead casting a thin halo of light. In front of him lay pieces of metal tubing, a dismantled pump, and a half-drunk cup of tea gone cold. He turned the cup slowly in his hand, staring at the thin layer of frost that had begun to form around its edge. The heat inside was fading fast, just like the engines. He leaned back and closed his eyes. In the darkness, he could still hear the roar of the bombers, the vibration through the floor, the silence that followed when one went missing. He remembered the faces of the men he'd spoken to hours before their last missions, the way they joked about bad weather or letters from home. They trusted the machines. They trusted him. That trust felt heavier than any metal he'd ever lifted. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a generator coughed, then steadied. Hale opened his eyes and reached for his pencil, drawing another set of lines across the logbook page. He sketched the fuel system again, tracing the path from the tanks to the engines. The lines looked simple enough, but he knew the truth lived in the invisible spaces between them. In pressure, in temperature, in seconds of reaction time. He whispered to himself, "What are you missing?" The clock ticked past midnight. By the early hours, frost had formed on the inside of the hangar windows. Hale hadn't moved in hours. His tea had frozen solid in its cup. Somewhere outside, a plane coughed to life for a test run. He heard the distant rumble, then the sharp sputter, the sudden silence. Another failure. He pushed back from the desk, heart pounding. The sound had confirmed what the papers couldn't. He ran outside into the cold, his boots splashing through puddles. The test crew stood confused by the idle bomber, its propellers still. "What happened?" Hale called out, same as before. The mechanic shouted, "Fuel flow cut off. We can't get it started again." Hale climbed onto the wing, peered down at the lines running along the fuselage. He reached out and touched the metal. It burned with cold. His fingers stuck briefly before he pulled them back. The frost had crawled right into the veins of the machine. He turned toward the mechanic. "Get me the pressure readings, all of them." They handed him a clipboard, numbers hastily scribbled. Pressure had dropped sharply, then flatlined. It wasn't mechanical. It was temperature. He felt a flicker of understanding, like the first spark before a fire, but it wasn't enough yet. He needed proof. As he climbed down, the mechanic looked at him with tired eyes. "You really think it's the cold?" Hale nodded slowly. "It's always the cold." He returned to the hangar, heart still racing. He could see it now. The invisible enemy, not in the air or in the sky, but inside the fuel itself. It froze, expanded, strangled the flow. The engines didn't die. They suffocated. He leaned against the workbench, breathing hard, the sound of the dead engine still echoing in his mind. Somewhere in that sound was the truth. He whispered, almost to himself, "If it's the cold that kills them, then heat must be what saves them." But how to bring heat where there was only ice? The question lingered in the air, heavier than the cold itself. Outside, the horizon began to pale once more. The night had given way to another frozen dawn, and with it, another mission waiting to be flown. Hale stared at the rising light and felt the weight of time pressing against him. Somewhere out there, men were preparing to fly into a storm of steel and fire, and if he couldn't find the answer soon, they would never come back. He looked down at his frozen teacup. A thin crack had formed along its rim. He touched it gently, almost reverently. The heat had escaped, but it had left its mark. And in that faint pattern of frost, the beginning of an idea flickered. Small, fragile, almost invisible, but it was there, waiting to be born, and frost. Arthur Hale lit the stove in the tool cage and watched the blue flame tremble in the draught. The warmth didn't make it far. Cold gathered in corners like a living thing. He pulled on stiff gloves, thumbed through his logbook, and dated a new page with a slow hand. The ink hesitated before it sank into the paper. The day already felt heavier than the last. The night test still rang in his ears, The falter, the silence, the unbearable pause before the propellers wound down. He copied the pressure drop again, tracing the numbers like a prayer he didn't believe in yet. 2 minutes of flutter, 1 minute of starvation, then nothing. A heartbeat measured in fuel. Outside, the first trucks rattled past with canvas flaps snapping in the wind. A crew shuffled into the briefing hut, boots caked in mud, shoulders squared by habit. Hale watched them go with the quiet attention of a man counting not bodies, but chances. He strapped his wristwatch tighter, as if that could hold back time, then carried an armful of copper offcuts to the bench. He heated a length of line over the stove until the metal blushed dimly. When he set it down, it fogged the air with a faint metallic sweetness. He blew across it and listened to the note. Too dull, too thick. Then slid the tubing into a tray of alcohol he had packed with ice shavings. The liquid stung his nose. Frost spidered across the surface almost instantly, blurring the reflection of the bulb above. He poured fuel from a marked can into a beaker and lowered a thin glass tube into the mix. The men called it petrol, but to Hale it was 100 small moods trapped in a single word. Density, vapor pressure, flash point, every temperament changing with the weather. He watched it thicken around the glass like a thought trying to slow down. He whispered the figures he'd memorized, viscosity at -20, -30, -40, and felt the numbers drift from his tongue like breath. A shadow fell across the bench. You can smell the cold from out there, the voice said. Hale glanced up. Flight Lieutenant Mason stood in the doorway, cap tilted back, eyes raw. The scarf at his throat still carried the white dusting of the road. He had been flying since dawn, or trying to. How many back? Hale asked. Mason's mouth tightened into something between a line and a wound. Not enough. They stood a moment without words. The stove hissed softly. The hanger cracked as ice adjusted its grip on steel. Mason's gloved hand drifted to the copper coil. You going to fix it with pipe and stubbornness? If stubbornness were heat, Hale said, we'd have a summer's worth. Mason's laugh was brief and dry. He leaned on the bench, shoulder to cold steel. We lost them at altitude, same as before, no warning, no smoke. He swallowed hard. It's like the sky pinches the line shut. We go to full rich, and the engines still whisper themselves to sleep. Hale felt each word land. 2 hours in, he asked, close. Mason said, closer this time. He tapped the watch on his wrist. At 2 hours, 5 minutes, a faint rattle. At 2:06, the needles drooped. We nursed it back down through cloud. It didn't want to live up there. He turned to go, then paused. You're the only one who doesn't blame us. It isn't you, Hale said quietly. Mason nodded once, a soldier accepting a verdict he already knew, and stepped back into the pale morning. The door shut with a soft, final click that felt larger than the sound it made. Hale wrote the times in his book without thinking, as if the pencil were moving of its own will. 2 hours, 5 minutes, 2:06. The fuel didn't freeze solid like glass. It thickened, grew lazy, clung to the inside of its little world until pumps begged and pressure fell. He sketched a crude cross, section of the line, shading the imagined frost that might creep along the inner wall. He drew arrows for heat that wasn't there. He took a coil of safety wire and wrapped it around the copper tube, tight as a snake. He had no proof that the wire would help. He only wanted friction, anything that might catch warmth and hold it. His fingers ached through the gloves. The wire bit his palm and left pale marks that vanished as quickly as they appeared. A mechanic brought a tray of components and set it down with a clatter. Orders from the colonel. The man said, he wants your notes on his desk by noon. Hale nodded and didn't look up. Orders from the colonel always arrived when the air grew coldest. He tested the line again, this time letting fuel creep through at a thin, steady pace. In the bath, bubbles tried to rise and failed. The pump word, the gauge needle wavered, and then hesitation, a stammer, the faintest cough of a machine that couldn't quite remember how to breathe. He shut it down. He walked the length of the hangar to the office that recognized itself by the smell of paper and tobacco. The colonel was already standing, a man who stood even when there was nowhere to go. Report, he said. Hale handed over the pages. Briggs scanned the first sheet. then the second, eyes narrowing at the hand. Drawn diagrams. You're telling me the lines are freezing, he said, as if the word itself were an accusation. I'm telling you the cold is changing the fuel's mind, Hale replied, careful with tone. It doesn't want to flow, it wants to cling. Briggs set the papers down, thumb pressing a crease that would never come out. Command wants pilot behavior corrected. Less aggressive climbing, more staged throttling. We'll drill it into them. You can drill all you want, Hale said, the restraint in his voice trembling. A dying pump doesn't care about discipline. Arthur, Briggs said, softer now. We need a fix we can name, not a ghost. Hale thought of the ghosts with names written in pencil. There is a fix, he said at last. There has to be, but I can't write it on your wall yet. Briggs looked past him to the window where the runway carved a cold scar through the fields. You have 3 days, he said. After that, I start cancelling missions I can't replace. He reached for his cigarette case and then stopped, as if lighting anything in this weather were an insult. And write the letters, he added. The family's from yesterday. His voice thinned. Do it before the light goes. Hale returned to the bench as if crossing a distance that hadn't existed a moment before. He set the copper aside and pulled a stack of forms close. Condolence letters were printed with blanks that pretended to be gentle. Name, rank, date, circumstance. He filled them with neat, precise strokes, because precision was the only respect he could offer now. He didn't mention the flavour of the air that morning or the way laughter sounded hollow when it echoed off metal. He wrote the words he was allowed to write and folded each page carefully, as if the crease were a kind of blessing. When the last envelope was sealed, the light had gone grey with afternoon. He stood, spine stiff, and wiped a hand across his face. The skin felt grainy, like the day had left dust behind. He put the letters in the out tray, then returned to the problem that would still be waiting in the dark. He raided the stores like a thief with permission. Dry ice from the medic's cold locker, salt, buckets, old blankets, a kettle nobody would miss. He built a small, stubborn winter on the floor beneath the test rig. Alcohol sloshed into a basin. Dry ice hissed and bloomed, smoke curling across the concrete like low cloud. He ran the pump longer this time, watching the needle tremble to a false confidence before the cold reached into the line and pinched. He set the kettle to boil on the stove and listened, eyes closed to the way heat announced itself, first a murmur, then a tightening whisper, then the tiny contained boil that promised not comfort, but change. He poured the hot water into a second basin and stood between them, one hand over cold, one over heat, like a priest deciding which sacrament mattered more. He dipped the copper line from the cold bath to the warm and back, counting under his breath. In the warm, the needle leaped. In the cold, it sagged. In between, it stuttered and begged for a reason to continue. He imagined the same path stretched across the belly of a bomber, warm near the engine, cruel in the airflow, merciless along the fuselage where wind bit hardest. He sketched another diagram, this one with small crosses where warmth might be borrowed and shared. The door opened again. Mason returned with his cap in his hands, hair flattened by the headset. We've got a window, he said. Fog lifting by evening, they'll send us anyway. His voice didn't carry complaint, only the quiet admission of a fact. Hale nodded without looking up. What altitude? Flight wants 20,000. The flax lighter above the 14s. He paused. We won't live there, Arthur. Hale lifted the line from the warm bath and let it drip, tiny beads forming, running, pausing, deciding. I need to know exactly where it dies. He said, the minute, the moment the needle shrugs. He looked at Mason, really looked, and saw a layer of fatigue that didn't belong to sleep or hunger. Bring me the times, bring me the sound. Mason's mouth tilted into the memory of a smile. The sound, you'll hear a change, Hale said. You always do before a thing fails. A whine becomes a whisper becomes a question. He tapped the gauge lightly. When it asks, write it down. Mason tightened his scarf and turned to leave. At the threshold he stopped and looked back. They think we're overreaching, he said. They think we're greedy for the sky. "The sky doesn't care about greed," Hale said, "it cares about physics." After he'd gone, the hangar felt larger, as if a wall had been removed. Hale went to the blackboard he'd commandeered from a training room and drew without plan. Pumps became lungs, lines became arteries. He wrote the temperatures he couldn't change and circled the ones he might coax. He wrote the word flow in capital letters and stared at it until the letters lost meaning and became shapes. A runner appeared, breath white, envelope in hand, from group. He said. Hale tore it open. The memo was clean and cruel, effective immediately, adjust climb profile, reduce initial throttle advance, increase mixture at altitude, review pilot discipline. He read it twice to be certain the words said what he already knew they would. He pinned it to the wood post and stood a moment longer, hands loose at his sides. By late afternoon the sky turned the color of old aluminum. Snow threatened, then reconsidered. The base slowed into a waiting that felt like prayer. Hale brewed tea on the stingy stove and watched the steam curl sideways in the draught. He wrapped his hands around the cup, took a breath with it, then set it down near the cold bath and forgot it there. He built one more test. He ran the line long, past what looked reasonable, with loops that would make any inspector frown. He clipped a small thermometer to the bend and wrote the temperature when the line began to glitter with frost. He rapped the tubing with a knuckle and listened to the ring. It sounded emptier than morning. He leaned his forearms on the bench and let his head fall forward. For a full minute he did nothing but breathe, each breath a small apology to time. He remembered a classroom years back, before the war, where a professor had scribbled equations for heat exchange until the chalk snapped. He remembered a boy in the second row asking if there were any beauty in it. The professor had said yes, but the beauty didn't care if you noticed. The door opened again, bringing in a strip of evening. Briggs stepped inside with his hat in his hand. He looked older than he had at noon. "They asked me to cut 2 more missions," he said. "I told them I would not." Something behind Hale's ribs tightened. "Then we hurry," he said. Briggs's eyes fell on the bowls of steaming water and ice, the jumble of copper like snakes asleep. "If command visits," he murmured, "I'll call it a calibration exercise." There was gratitude in Hale's silence. The colonel drifted to the out tray, touched the letters with one finger, then stepped back as if the paper were hot. "Thank you," he said. When night took the windows, the generator flicked and held. The radio stuttered to life with a weather report that sounded like bad poetry. Hale recorded the numbers, drew a thin line from the data to his sketch, and tried to imagine warm hands 6 miles above the earth. He laid out a plan that wasn't a plan. Insulate the sections that could be insulated. Move the pump closer to heat. Design a sleeve that might steal a little warmth from where the engine shed it as waste. Each note began with if, and each if carried a silent please. He worked until his fingers lost the ambition to grip. He stood and flexed them, blood creeping back in needles. In the basin, the dry ice exhaled its last white sigh and went quiet. On the bench, the forgotten cup of tea had cooled to the room and then past it. A thin rim of frost had formed where the liquid kissed ceramic. He touched that rim lightly and watched it melt under a thumbprint. When the telephone rang, the sound cracked the air like brittle glass. He lifted the receiver and spoke his name. Mason's voice was a whisper with weather in it. "We're on final," he said. "We dropped early. Engines held until 2 hours 7. He paused. At 2:08, a cough. At 2:10, a shiver. At 2:11, she thought about dying. Then we dove through cloud and the world remembered us. Hale closed his eyes. The numbers fell into the shape he had drawn an hour before. "Thank you," he said. "I'm listening." "Arthur," Mason added, softer. We had frost on the window inside. He sounded like a man describing an animal in a place it shouldn't be. It crept where breath should be. The line clicked dead. Hale stayed with the receiver to his ear, listening to a silence that carried more weight than sound. He set it down and looked around the hangar as if the answer might be hiding in plain sight. Everywhere he let his gaze land, there was the same message written in different alphabets. The cold would always come. Heat would always flee. He turned back to the board and wrote one word where he could not ignore it. Transfer. He underlined it twice. He wrote it again, smaller, like a secret. Past midnight, he left the hangar and crossed the tarmac. The air bit the inside of his nose and filled his lungs with a sharp, medicinal sting. He walked under the wing of a Lancaster and laid a hand on the skin where rivets caught starlight. The metal held the cold like a vow. He imagined heat nesting in the engine nacelles, nowhere to go but out, bleeding into a night that would drink it happily. If he could persuade a little of that warmth to take a detour, to touch the line that wanted to sleep, he could keep the machine awake. Back inside, he sat on the stool and stared at the benches, the kettle, the basins, the coils, the instruments that told him what he already knew. His mind circled the same path and found the same fence, a loop he couldn't cut. He reached for the cup to drink the last of the tea and stopped. In the weak light, something delicate played across the surface. The tiniest quiver, a breath made visible. A thread of vapour rose and curled, then vanished, then rose again. Warmth trying to escape, choosing the easiest path. He leaned closer. The rim of the cup gleamed with a narrow band where the frost had yielded. The place where edge met air stitched itself to the room differently than the place where liquid met porcelain. He turned the cup half an inch. The vapour shifted its route, found a new curve to follow, and left the old one to cool. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He only watched the invisible choose a path because the shape of the vessel told it to. He set the cup down with deliberate care and drew a small, swift curve on the corner of his page. Not a plan, just a gesture, a reminder that heat could be persuaded to travel if given a road that felt natural. He rested the pencil, closed the book, and exhaled through his nose in a slow, controlled line. Outside, a bomber barked once and fell quiet, like a dog called back from the door. Somewhere, a gramophone bled a thin ribbon of music, brave against the cold. The clock over the office door ticked in evenly spaced forgiveness. Hale cleaned the bench, not because it needed it, but because order was the only kindness he had left to offer the night. He laid the copper straight, folded the wire back into its reel, set the kettle on its side so it wouldn't sing to itself. When he finally switched off the lamp, the hangar surrendered to darkness without protest. He stood in the doorway, hand on the frame, and looked out at the runway where frost wrote its simple poem across the earth. He imagined the fuel inside those waiting wings, liquid that wanted to be faithful until the cold changed its mind. He imagined a promise to keep it moving. He stepped into the cold and let the door fall shut behind him. His breath rose, drifted, and disappeared the way all breath does long before morning. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the sleeping barracks, thinking not of the thing that would save them, but of the shape it might eventually take when it finally told him its name. He didn't know it yet, but he would soon be asked for explanations softer than the truth and answers that fit on a single page. He would be told to hurry and then told to wait. He would be given 3 days that felt like one. Before any of that, he needed to sleep like a man holding a thread that could snap if he dreamed too hard. He lay down in a narrow bed, boots on the floor, logbook under the pillow, the smell of oil ghosting the room. He closed his eyes and saw copper lines stretched across a winter sky, a river you could not see unless you knew where to look. In the in-between place where minds drift before they fall, he chased a small curl of steam across the rim of a teacup until it touched something he could not name and then was gone. Morning would come with clipped boots and clipped voices, with men who did not have time for wonder. The problem would still be there, colder by a few degrees. The pressure would sharpen, the questions would tighten, and the day would ask not for theory but for proof. He would give it what he could. For now, night held the base in a thin, merciful pause. The wind moved through the gutters with a sound like pages turning. Somewhere in the dark, the dry ice took its last breath and decided not to be winter anymore. In that hush, Hale's last clear thought before sleep was not about equations or pumps or the authority of memos. It was a memory of heat choosing the easiest path, the smoothest arc, the gentlest descent. A choice that could be guided. He did not hear the generator stumble and catch again. He did not hear Briggs moving through the office, leaving a fresh stack of forms that pretended there were right words for the worst days. He did not hear Mason sit on the step outside, head in hands, counting the seconds between what if and what now. He slept, and the problem did not. Dawn would demand movement. Dawn would demand answers. And with it would come the first notes of the pressure that would drive him beyond patience and into the narrow corridor where necessity becomes invention. Tomorrow, the laws of thermodynamics would not become kinder, but they would become personal. April 1943, the second week, 04:12. Cold pressed through the barracks walls until the wood ticked like a metronome. Arthur Hale woke before the bugle, the way men do when sleep becomes untrustworthy. He lay still a moment, tasting the metallic dryness the generators left in the air, and listened to the faint, patient beat of rain on tar paper. His hand slid beneath the pillow for the logbook, as if the softness of paper could anchor him to sense, and he made a single note by feel, 2:08, choose the path for heat. The corridor outside smelled of wet wool and soap. Somewhere a kettle rattled, somewhere a shoe scraped, somewhere a cough finished a sentence he didn't want to read aloud. He stepped into his boots, shrugged into his coat, and crossed the yard. The dawn was the colour of old pewter. Wind moved like a rumour across the flat. He let himself into the hangar and turned on the lamp above the bench. The cone of light fell onto copper coils, a small forest of curves waiting for a reason to exist. The teacup still sat where he'd left it, rim white as a small shoreline. He set it aside like a relic and laid out the day's intentions. Measure, test, cool, warm, repeat. Knowing that intention and outcome rarely shook hands in here. The base began to stir, not all at once but in a rising ripple. Kitchen clatter, a truck's throat. Clearing, the first reluctant laughter that was less mood than muscle memory. On the radio, the announcer's voice tried to thread good news into a fabric that wouldn't hold. Hale wrote the weather figures on the blackboard and boxed them in. -28 at 20:00, wind aloft steady west, cloud broken. He underlined -28 twice, as if the pencil could bully numbers into behaving. By 6, the briefing room was full. The projector clicked, maps unrolled like brittle scrolls, and the operations officer walked his stick along a string of towns that had been real to someone once. The men nodded because nodding took less from them than questions. Hale stood at the back with a thermos that had forgotten how to keep promises and watched faces fold into readiness. His eyes found Mason, a slight tilt to the man's smile as if he were saving half of it for later. Hale took that as a kindness. When it ended, chairs shuffled, boots scraped, paper snapped. On the way out the door, a captain he barely knew tapped him on the sleeve. They say we're riding the throttles too hard on climb. The man said without stopping, "Tell them I'll ride it however keeps us in the sky." And then he was gone, absorbed by the morning the way sound is eaten by wind. Hale followed Briggs back to the office. The colonel lit a cigarette with a steady hand and failed to inhale. "Command wants written acknowledgement from engineering that pilot discipline is under review," he said. Hale's mouth tasted of metal again. "I can review behaviour," he said, "but I can't fix a physics problem with manners." Briggs looked at him with a tired patience that remembered better days. "Write the sentence," he said, "then go fix the physics." So Hale wrote it, 3 lines that said nothing he believed, and signed his name like a man endorsing a weather system. He carried the paper to the comms hut himself, past a row of bicycles leaning into one another for warmth, past the medic store where iodine out argued the smell of damp. In the hut, the telegrapher glanced up and nodded with the intimacy of men who spend their days listening to what the air decides to keep. Back in the hangar, the day grew muscle. Tests began and failed with the steady, stubborn rhythm of a man teaching a mule to spell. He rigged a sleeve around a length of tubing and ran hot air from a small duct into it. He packed a second section in salt and ice and asked the pump to choose between them. The gauge described a small hope, and then thought better of it. He tried moving the pump closer to the simulated engine warmth. The needle rose like a hand in a crowded room and then slipped away. By mid-morning, he had burned 2 fingertips and the edge of his temper. He turned down the lamp until the bench was a small stage, then leaned close enough to see his breath fog the tube. It left a delicate bloom that vanished as quickly as it arrived, like good ideas in bad weather. He wrote, "Heat must be invited, not shouted at." Then he frowned at the sentence for being too pretty and crossed it out. A runner delivered a tray of parts and a folded note. Hale opened it and recognized the slanted script before the name, Mason, written quickly, as if caught between tasks. 2 hours, 8. Sound, thin, will be higher today. If there's anything I can try that won't kill us, say it. Hale stood with the paper a long time and then wrote back one word, listen. He knew it wasn't enough. He sent it anyway. The first mission of the day lifted into a sky that had not yet decided if it wanted to be kind. The bombers went up like dark promises, one by one, the sound a wide, trembling cord that reached into the hangar and shook the tools on their pegs. Hale stood in the doorway and counted until they were only a smudge. Then he went back to the bench because standing still had become its own cruelty. He stripped a length of copper until it shone like an answer and wound it around a cylinder same diameter as the fuel line. He didn't know yet that he was drawing the first outline of a heat exchanger in a language made of guesses. He only knew that when heat loved a surface, it travelled. He rigged a small loop from the warmed bath, a return barely more than a whisper, and let it kiss the cold section on its way back to where it started. The gauge flickered, he blinked, the needle held, then sagged, then steadied again as if recalling a tune. He spoke aloud to no one, find the path. The words hovered like breath and disappeared. At 11, the generator coughed and caught. The lights in the far hangar blinked in sympathy. A corporal came for him with a stack of envelopes and a clumsy apology. Sir, the forms, Mrs. Alden, Mrs. Pickering, Mr. Wallace. The names were a litany he didn't want to learn. Hale took the stack and felt the paper weigh more than paper should. He wrote what the war decreed and what decency allowed. He did not mention frost inside windows. He did not mention 208. When he finished, he washed his hands as if the ink could stain skin from the inside, then returned to the rig, the warm loop into the cold sleeve. The needle testing the idea, he rerouted the return, shortened it by inches, and watched the gauge respond like a pulse under a physician's fingers. He took a scrap of chalk and, on the blackboard, drew the whole loop in tidy white. Heat out of the engine shell, a bleed through a coiled jacket, a gift of warmth to the line and back again. No pumps added, no parts beyond copper and nerve. He hated how hopeful it looked. The phone rang. He lifted the receiver with a heartbeat in his palm, a voice he didn't know, flat with exhaustion. Turnaround complete for the first wave. We're missing 6. The click was gentle, as if the man had set the handset down so it wouldn't wake anyone. Hale stood very still. 6 names he had not yet learned how to carry. He turned to the board and wrote beside the drawing, a small dash where a man might have been. Then he erased the dash because the board was not the place for grief. He returned to the tubing with a resolve that felt less like anger and more like accuracy sharpened to a needle. He hunted losses along the line the way a farmer checks fences. He pressed each joint until his thumb went numb, wrapped frayed cloth where frost insisted on making itself seen, and spoke the temperatures under his breath as if they were the alphabet of prayer. When a leak in the test Bath sighed and confessed itself with a thread of bubbles, he fixed it without ceremony. When a clamp cracked, he did not swear. The day had made a ritual out of refusing drama. Noon bit cleanly. The mess hall served a stew that smelled like salt and surrender. He ate standing by the bench, the spoon drum, tapping the tin lid with an absent patience. Across the hangar, men laughed at something too small to survive the afternoon. The radio found a cheerful song and then lost it to static. He kept eating because the body insists, then set the cup aside and tuned the pump by ear until the wine landed in the narrow saddle between complaint and efficiency. A new memo arrived, crisp with authority and smudged where someone's thumb had pressed too hard. Immediate, install additional thermal lagging on exposed lines. Immediate, verify mixture control training. Hale circled thermal lagging and wrote next to it, bandages on a broken bone. He didn't pin this one to the post. He folded it once and slid it into the logbook's back cover. He didn't want the men to read that the cure for cold was a thicker coat. Afternoon darkened early, as if the day had decided to be brief to spare them. Clouds sank and pressed their weight onto the field. Hale adjusted the warm loop again, this time letting a fraction more heat stay in the jacket before it fled. The gauge steadied. He capped the vent and watched the needle hold as he bled cold down the line. A minute passed, too. In the bath, Frost tried to take the metal and failed at the seam he had wrapped with wire that morning. The failure was small, and it was beautiful. He wrote, "Small gifts, continuous," and underlined continuous until the paper thinned. Briggs appeared without noise. He watched the needle for a long count and then cleared his throat. "I don't need to understand it," he said, "but I need to know if you can scale it." Hale didn't look away. "Copper we have," he said. "Man-hours will borrow from sleep. I want to prove it ugly here before I make it tidy there." Briggs gave a curt nod. "Group is coming at 1600. Wear a clean shirt and the most boring face you have. That one's natural." Hale said, but the humour landed softly and broke. They stood together as the pump hummed a thin hymn. Rain strengthened into a fine, committed line, drumming on the roof with a patience engineered to outlast men. Somewhere, a jeep coughed and settled. Far off, a dog barked at something only dogs can argue with. At 15:50, the base commander and two officers from Group stepped into the hangar with hats that had never been wet. Their eyes handled the place like auditors handle ledgers. Hale greeted them in a voice that had learned to iron itself smooth. He walked them through the board, kept his sentences uncluttered, and did not invite metaphor. Heat borrowed, heat given, flow maintained. He gestured to the gauge, which chose that moment to behave, and felt both grateful and wary. The taller visitor, silver hair, a face weathered into the shape of certainties, said, "You're proposing to graft a heating loop onto operational fuel lines in wartime conditions." "I'm proposing to keep men alive," Hale said. The room seemed to hold its breath, then exhale through the pump's steady murmur. "Pilot error remains the primary concern." The officer continued, "We will modify procedures regardless." "You can discipline a man's hand," Hale answered. "You cannot discipline the cold." A silence opened that didn't want to close. Briggs stepped into it with the ease of a man who had learned how to move weather. "We'll trial the modification on one airframe," he said. "Engineering will certify it safe for ground run by tomorrow. If it holds, we advance. If it fails, we don't waste a single extra word." Hale appreciated the colonel's "we" more than he could say. The visitors left the way storms do, without apology. Hale watched their backs to the door, then turned to the coil on the bench as if it were an animal that might bolt. He felt the day tilt beneath him into something narrower than hope and wider than fear. He wrote a list, not of tasks but of dependencies, each arrow a small vow. Heat source, jacket, contact, flow, return. He underlined contact. If the copper didn't kiss the line properly, it would only pretend to help. Evening bled in. Floodlights licked the tarmac into brightness. The first wave returned in fragments, engines labouring, tyres hissing. Men climbed down and learned how to stand again. The medics moved in practiced lines. Hale heard the count before he saw the faces. He didn't like the math. He went to the edge of the apron anyway, because avoidance was a luxury he had forfeited. Mason came down the ladder with a gait borrowed from someone older. His cheeks were raw. His eyes were the wrong kind of clear. He walked to Hale and stood too straight. 2:08. He said 2:10, 2:12, each a sentence shorter than the last. He looked at the sky as if he might memorize it just in case. We dropped early again. Flack was bored with us and then offended. "Windows?" Hale asked. "Frost on the inside." Mason said, "A lace." Someone dragged a gloved thumb through it and made a path to look out. It felt like cheating. He swallowed a slow breath. "Arthur, whatever you're building, make it stubborn." Hale touched the copper with his knuckles, little taps a man gives a friend to wake him. "It will be," he said, "it has to be." Night pulled tight. The mess hall filled and emptied in gusts. Someone found the gramophone and made it apologize for the day. In the hangar, Hale cut and bent and wound until the coil he wanted lay in his hands like a question asked properly for the first time. He strapped the jacket to a length of mock fuel line and ran the warm loop through. The pump sang. The needle leaned into steadiness with the sleepy confidence of a child who has been told a story worth believing. He set the assembly aside and scrubbed the bench as if a general would inspect it for dust and find fault with the arrangement of atoms. He knew this wasn't the invention. That word would always be too grand for what he did, but the direction of it was true. He would have to ask a crew to fly with it. He would have to say, "Trust this thing that was an idea 12 hours ago." He would have to test it on the ground and listen for what the metal said when heat walked its new path. A knock came at the side door, small and polite. Briggs stood with his cap off, hair damp, eyes shined by weather and worry. "You'll have your airframe," he said. Mason volunteered. Hale felt the sentence as a blow and then as a benediction. "Of course he did," he said. Briggs stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it as if guarding the night from coming any farther. "I can give you until dawn," he said. "After that, whatever you build goes onto that Lancaster by men who will follow your drawings like scripture and curse you in the same breath." Hale nodded. "I'll earn both." They stood in the quiet and let the pump do the talking. The needle held. The bath steamed and smoked like argument and agreement deciding to share a table. The phone didn't ring. The wind changed its mind and moved the clouds around the moon just enough to make the world look briefly different. Hale marked the copper with grease pencil where bends must land. He lay the tube against the mock line and tightened the straps until the two pieces learned each other's shape. He soldered carefully, the flame low. The heat kept gentle, so it would remember gentleness later. Flux smelled of acid and memory. He wiped the joints clean until they were honest. He checked the time 23:11, and wrote it down for no reason except that he had run out of other reasons. He warmed the loop. He cooled the line. He watched the frost rush and retreat and rush again, and this time spend itself before it could settle. He whispered the names he'd written that afternoon without meaning to, as if calling roll in a class that would never be full again. Close to midnight, a ground crewman drifted in, eyes narrow with curiosity. "Sir," he said, "you'll want to choose a path along the belly of the frame that won't catch the wind this cruel." He traced a line in the air with a greasy finger. Hale nodded and adjusted his drawing, grateful for the simple wisdom of men who knew how air felt at speed. He cleaned the last of the solder from the coil and set both palms flat on the bench. The wood was warm where the lamp had leaned in all day. His hands remembered tools, his eyes asked for a little mercy. He thought of the cup and the curl of steam choosing the rim's easiest curve. He thought of the way heat hated standing still. He turned out the bench lamp and left the blackboard lit. The coil gleamed dully in the chalk light. Outside, the field held its breath again, waiting for the hour when machines become shadows and men become not quite either. Hale locked the hanger, slid the key into his pocket, and stood on the threshold with the night stuck to his coat. He did not speak the fear that sat under his tongue like a coin. That tomorrow he would discover the coil was a beautiful idea and a useless thing. He did not promise himself anything he couldn't buy with copper and hours. He only let the cold bite him cleanly, so he would remember in his bones what the line would feel at 20,000, and whispered to no one, "Hold." He walked back toward the barracks with the steady gait of a man carrying an answer that was almost heavy enough to be real. Behind him, the hangar kept its own counsel. Before him, morning sharpened on a whetstone of orders he could not soften. He didn't know it yet, but at first light he would discover a flaw so small it could hide inside a weld bead, and so dangerous it could turn promise into ruin unless he found it in time. Dawn came thin and colourless, a sheet of light pulled too tight. Hale unlocked the hangar at 05:07 and felt the night fall away in brittle pieces. The coil he'd finished before midnight lay where he'd left it, a question waiting to be asked again. He ran his thumb along each joint, eyes finding what fingers missed, and stopped at a place no bigger than a freckle, an uneven ring of solder that lifted, the faintest ridge where smooth should have held. He pressed and the metal gave him a whisper, not a leak yet, a promise of one. He stripped the joint with a patience he'd learned from broken clocks. He cleaned the copper until it remembered how to shine, then brought the flame in low, fed it just enough to flow, not enough to bully. The new bead circled the line like a vow. He cooled it with a damp cloth and listened to the way heat retreated. Slow now, reluctant, better. By 06:20 the bass had found its morning voice, boots crossing puddles, a lorry scolding itself into motion, the clink of mugs from the mess. Hale set the rig live, warmth into jacket, cold into line. The gauge climbed and steadied, then held in that narrow place where hope wears a plain coat. He wrote the numbers down as they came, an honest script of seconds that refused drama. No flutter, no cough. He allowed himself one breath that went all the way to the bottom of his lungs. A mechanic slid through the door with a tool roll and a smile that hadn't decided to live on his face yet. They're asking if the mad coil is ready for a walk. He said, "It is." Hale answered, "We'll fit her to Mason's ship." Lancaster K9. The man said, "She bites if you don't introduce yourself." They brought the coil to life on the bench one last time, ran a final chill over the line until Frost considered its old ambitions and withdrew. Then they wrapped the assembly in burlap and carried it across the tarmac between puddles that mirrored the pale sky. The Lancaster crouched with a kind of animal patience, belly streaked by yesterday's weather, rivets throwing tiny halos where the light dared to break through. Mason met them under the wing with a thermos and a grin that looked borrowed. "Tell me this will make a liar of the cold," he said. "It will give it something to argue with," Hale replied, and that was all he would promise. They lifted the panel and entered the narrow space where machines remembered that men had made them. The air smelled of fuel and aluminum and old sweat. Hale ran a hand along the existing line, tracing its path like a pilgrim learning a relic, then marked the section where jacket and copper would embrace. The crew chief watched with an expression that carried a little suspicion and a lot of love for anything that kept engines honest. "Here," the chief said, tapping a rib, "don't steal too much airflow. It's cruel at 20,000, like a blade." Hale nodded. "We'll hug close." They strapped the jacket on with bands that had lived other lives holding other hopes. The coil circled the line in neat curves, the metal touching metal, as if memory could move from one into the other. They ran the warm loop from a feed off the engine's waste heat, a careful theft of what would otherwise be squandered on sky. The return line they kept short, sending what remained of warmth home before it forgot its purpose. By 09:15 they were ready to breathe. The crew stepped back. Hale called for the cart. The starter screamed, the prop bit the air, and the engine caught with a grudging joy that always sounded like defiance. He leaned into the compartment and watched the jacket while the RPM rose. The coil trembled, then settled. He touched a gloved finger to the band. It held a living heat, not enough to scald, just enough to remind. "Pressure?" he asked. The crew chief checked his instrument, holding. Hale nodded once. "Drop her to idle." The engine sank to a mutter. The needle did not flinch. He felt his shoulders loosen and realized only then how tight they had been bound. He signaled for cut. The propeller wound down through a dozen aching harmonies and stopped. Briggs arrived with the wind in his coat, and the set of a man braced for good news handled like bad. He took in the coil, the straps, the way the jacket sat like a second skin, and said nothing for a span of heartbeats. "Ground run holds," Hale said. Briggs looked at Mason. "You still volunteering?" Mason clicked his thermos lid closed with a sound that pretended to be a joke. "I'd rather fly with stubborn copper than with polite paperwork." "Very well," Briggs said. "Afternoon test hop. Up to 14, then step to 18 if the world stays generous. Engineering rides along for the first circuit." Hale blinked. "I ride." Briggs met his eyes. "If you're willing." He softened the edges. "And if you're not, I don't want your invention." Hale felt fear and duty meet like two men in a narrow doorway. "I'm willing," he said. It surprised him how true the words felt. He wanted to hear the machine speak under his hands. They used the morning as if it might run away. Hale crawled back through the Lancaster's belly and checked every clamp with the same care a surgeon gives a suture. He tightened one band by half a turn, found a nick in a hose and replaced it before anyone else could see and doubt. He ran the warm loop again on cart power to feel for shiver or sulk. The coil answered with steady breath. Just before noon, a runner huffed in with a folded sheet that smelled of fresh ink. Group Want status, he said, then noticed Hale in the bay and flinched like a man who had interrupted a prayer. Hale wiped his hands and wrote a line that felt like breaking rules without quite doing it. Modification installed. Ground run stable, flight test scheduled. He handed it back and returned to the metal, the only conversation he trusted. The weather grudged them a corridor, thin and usable. At 13:40 they rolled K9 onto the runway, the coil hidden like a risk between ribs. Hale took the jump seat behind the engineer's panel, headphones biting his ears, checklist open, pencil ready. Mason's voice came over the intercom steady and exact, a man teaching his own heart to behave. Mixture rich, props full forward, boost ready. Hale laid a hand against the jacketed line and knew more than he could measure. He gave a thumb, up the crew could feel but not see, and Mason eased the throttles forward into the day. Acceleration pinned them to the moment. The airfield ran beneath like a thought you're afraid to say and then commit to anyway. They lifted, the ground let go, and the sky took custody. Hale fixed his eyes on the gauge he trusted least, fuel pressure. It held at climb, a thread drawn taut but not frayed. At 6,000 feet the cold began to speak. It announced itself in the window's breathless clarity, in the way sound tucked in close to the skin, in the faint ache across the cheekbones that told you the world up here had rules it did not negotiate. At 10,000, Hale felt the line with the back of his hand, the jacket warm without vanity, the coil humming its small song. Pressure steady. Step to 14, Mason said. The air thinned, the light hardened, the world below flattened into a map that forgot it used to be fields and chimneys and men who drank tea at tables. Hale watched the needle expect a dip and find none. He wrote the minute down anyway. The habit of waiting for failure can take the shape of faith. 18, Mason said. The Lancaster levelled. The wind pressed its argument harder. The crew engineer called numbers from a mouth that had learned to keep courage in it. Hale pressed his palm to the line again. Warmth met him like a handshake that didn't pretend to be more than it was. At 19,000, the engine gave a small, offended rattle. Every man held his breath at once. Hale leaned in until his headset pressed the bones of his skull. The rattle subsided. The needle dipped the width of a pencil mark and came back as if embarrassed. Hale let out a long, slow breath that he hadn't authorized. They held, they circled, and then they came down through layered cloud like a letter slipping under a door. Wheels kissed runway. Brakes told their simple truth. They taxied in. The ground felt improbably certain. The crew removed helmets with hands that didn't quite believe. Mason turned in his seat and looked at Hale through the narrow gap where hours become sentences. It didn't want to die, he said. Then it won't. Hale answered and allowed himself the first small smile in days. On the apron, men drifted in from other jobs with the casual gravity of planets. They touched the coil casing as if superstition wore the same boots as science. The crew chief pursed his mouth and tried not to grin. Not bad for a mad loop, he conceded. The afternoon chewed itself down to bone. Reports were filed, numbers entered, signatures gather, each with the dignity of necessary lies and the honesty of earned facts. Briggs collected them all like a man carrying water in his hat, and went off to pour them at a door that would not open easily. Hale returned to the hangar, sat at the bench and let his hands go quiet. The kettle hissed. He poured and watched steam flinch, then rise, then curl along the cup's rim. The sight tickled the back of his mind, the way a melody does when you can hum it, but not yet name it. Heat looking for a path, choosing the easy one, loving curve more than edge. He took a sip that warmed his mouth and then set the cup near a scrap of polished copper. The vapor bent toward the brighter metal. He blinked, frowned at his own fancy, and pushed the cup away. There were too many ways to lie to yourself when you needed answers. Evening walked in, shoulders hunched. The mess served a stew that reminded you to eat more than it asked you to enjoy. Hale stayed with the plane. He wrote instructions a tired man could follow at 2 in the morning. Cut here, wrap here, anchor here, bleed here, do not over-tighten. He drew the jacket as a living thing, arrows showing where warmth would move and where it must not. His sentences were short, not because he was abrupt, but because breath had become a currency. Briggs reappeared at 19:10 with his hat brim dripping. Group approved a limited rollout, he said, voice flat from the effort of winning. 8 airframes, then 8 more if the first 8 bring everyone home with engines still loving us. Hale felt something loosen that had been cinched around his ribs since winter. We'll start tonight, he said. You'll sleep first, Briggs answered. Hale shook his head. I've slept enough to be dangerous. The colonel studied him, found no victory in arguing, and relented with a sigh that sounded like a man hanging his coat on the last nail. Then work until you stop making sense, not 1 minute more. Night gathered the mechanics into teams that moved with wordless intelligence. Copper gleamed under lamps like river water under a pale moon. Jackets settled along lines with the right kind of embrace. Hale circulated, helping where hands needed to remember how to be careful, stepping back where men performed the expertise that never asked for applause. He felt the base change temperature, not warmer, not colder, simply more alive with doing. Somewhere between engines, a chaplain passed with a toolbox, sleeves rolled, collar lost in a scarf. He tightened a strap with a grace that didn't need a pulpit. We serve where we stand, he said, not to Hale and not to himself, a sentence that found a place to live in the air and stayed there. At 22:40, fatigue began to turn small steps into tricky arithmetic. Hale mislaid a wrench and found it in his other hand. He put a rag in his pocket and discovered a letter there instead, one of the day's notices he had forgotten to send. He slipped it out and read the name in the glow of the lamp. The ink had bled a little where the paper had met the weather, as if grief had tried to escape and changed its mind. He folded it back carefully and set it with the others, a small stack that watched him from the corner of the bench. Midnight found them on the 6th installation. The coil clung to the line like a last good idea. The crew chief turned to Hale with a question shaped like a dare. You ever think, he said, that the sky just wants us to stop trying? Hale glanced at the copper, his hands black with grease and steadiness. The sky doesn't want, he said. It keeps its own counsel. We're the ones who want. That's the problem and the answer. The chief grunted, a sound not quite agreement and not quite refusal, and cinched the last band as if he were tying a knot in weather. At 01:20, a hose split at a clamp and sprayed a mean mist over Hale's sleeve. He shut the valve so fast his knuckles opened. Blood made little red flowers along the cuff. He didn't notice until the mechanic nearest him cursed and fetched a rag. You're no good to us empty, the man said, wrapping the cloth around Hale's hand with a practical tenderness. I'm not good to you idle, Hale answered, and they both pretended the line was witty. By 02:10, 8 airframes wore their copper-like armor they hadn't asked for but might come to love. The last crew went back through each joint with a light and a fingertip, blessing every seam. Hale leaned against a crate and let gravity have him while he watched the kettle breathe on the bench. Steam rose and licked the rim and followed the curve and chose, always, the curve. He frowned at the thought because it refused to remain only a thought. It wanted shape. He moved to the blackboard and, without deciding to, drew a circle and then another around it, thin lines that suggested a conversation between one metal and another. He marked the direction of flow with arrows that curved instead of stabbed. He wrote a single word so small it barely belonged to ink, coax. The word looked incorrect, impolite among the stark numerals and orders. He capped the chalk and went back to the coil, touched it with the bandaged hand, and felt warmth that belonged to discipline more than to passion. He could not have explained to anyone standing there why that made him almost happy. Outside, the runway lights hummed. Snow had started, the tiny, dry kind that lands without decision and then takes it back. The field smelled so clean it almost hurt. Hale stood in the doorway and counted the planes now wearing their stubborn bracelets. 8 could be a miracle. 8 could be a failure multiplied by 8. He felt the coin of fear under his tongue again, and moved it to his cheek like a child hiding candy. He went back to the bench to write the last notes the night demanded. He told the morning crews to check for seep at the lower bands, to look for hoarfrost along the shadowed side, to keep the warm loop vented in the first minutes of run, so heat wouldn't pool like a sulk. He drew the path again, simpler this time, the jacket and the line, the way one whispered to the other until both remembered how to move. At 03:30, Briggs returned, coat dusted white. He looked older now in a way that had nothing to do with years. He scanned the row of modified bombers and nodded once to no one. "We'll brief at 5. He said, "Wheels at 7. Weather gives us a narrow throat. We'll go through it like gentlemen." Hale lifted the letters, gave them to the colonel. "These need posting," he said, voice careful. Briggs took the stack the way a man takes a new bore. Awkward, reverent, afraid to drop the world. "I'll see to it," he said. They were alone for a breath that knew what it was. Briggs touched Hale's bandaged hand with one finger. "Did we buy them a chance?" he asked. "We bought them argument." Hale said, "Sometimes that's enough." The colonel nodded and walked into the whitening dark. The hangar exhaled and fell quieter than a building that held machines had any right to be. Hale poured the last of the kettle into his cup and watched the steam's small theatre one more time. Rise, curve, cling. The cup's rim was cold, the liquid warm. The meeting between them drew a faint lace he hadn't noticed before. He tipped the cup, and the lace shifted its seam, chasing ease. He closed his eyes and saw the jacket not as a band but as a conversation, the coil not wrapped but inviting, a geometry of kindness rather than force. He saw, without yet naming, the shape of a road heat would take if the road pleased it. He felt the kind of quiet that happens right before a thought says its first true word. A truck rattled past and shook the moment apart. The gramophone in the mess scraped out a tune too brave for the hour. Somewhere, someone laughed and then apologized to the dark. Hale finished the tea and set the empty cup down on the blackboard ledge. He looked at the curve of the rim, the shine of the copper, the chalk arrows that had chosen not to be straight. He wiped his hands, picked up a grease pencil, and drew 2 more loops onto the morning's plan, slight adjustments that would make the jacket hold heat the way a hand holds another hand. Not tight, not loose, just honest. He capped the pencil and leaned his head against the cool post. For a heartbeat he could feel the whole machine. The base, the men, the planes, the weather, the long wire of need that ran through all of it, thrumming at one note. He did not know what the note meant yet. He only knew it was true. In less than 2 hours, crews would file into briefing with eyes that belonged to yesterday, and mouths that had learned how to be brave without promising anything. In 4, engines would make the kind of music that draws maps over Europe. In 6, the sky would try its old tricks. In 7, the coil would either speak in the language Hale had begged it to learn, or refuse and send him back to the bench with a grief that did not accept compromises. He picked up the cup again, held it a little closer to the lamp, and watched the small, stubborn curl of steam choose its path along porcelain. He didn't call it an answer, not yet, but he let it sit in him the way a word sits in the mouth before it belongs to anyone. Outside, the first grey of morning tugged at the edges of the night. Somewhere, a man cleared his throat and straightened his tie for a meeting with weather and chance. The hangar smelled of oil and hot metal cooling and paper that still waited for ink. Hale whispered to the coil, to the cup, to the line, to the day that would ask more than any single man should have to give, hold. He didn't know it yet, but before the sun climbed above the low cloud, the curl of steam on that chipped rim would stop being a curiosity and become a map. A simple, stubborn map that would carry men through cold that had forgotten how to be merciful. April 1943, 04:47. The lamp stuttered twice and steadied, throwing a small, stubborn circle of light over Hale's bench. Outside, the hangar doors held back a world of iron air and colourless dawn. Inside, breath made brief clouds that broke and vanished. He wrote the date in the margin of his logbook and underlined it, not for ceremony but to remind the page that time mattered. The coil had behaved through the night. 8 airframes wore their copper jackets like promises that could not yet be kept in public. Hale felt the weariness of men who trade hours for clarity, a good bargain until the bill arrives in bones and hands. He loosened the bandage over his knuckles, flexed the stiff fingers, and poured what the kettle offered. Steam rose, delicate as script, and curved along the rim, as if the cup were a hill the air preferred to climb. He watched that curve with the attention a listener gives a whisper he knows is meant for him. The vapour did not rush, it chose. It traced a smooth path along porcelain where the surface welcomed it, and lifted away where the angle pinched. He shifted the cup half an inch. The steam rethought its route, and turned as if relenting to a more gracious road. The hangar ticked, a far skylight thinned with grey. He set the cup down very slowly, eyes on the thin ring of moisture the breath had left behind, a faint, sloping arc where warm met cold, and decided to linger before leaving. He touched the arc with the back of his nail. It broke and formed a fraction to the left, as if the curve itself wanted comfort. He drew a line on the page, a simple crescent, then another inside it, and wrote beside them, "Heat prefers ease." Give it shape. The sentence looked like vanity on the paper, so he underlined shape until the boast bled out and only instruction remained. He pulled the coil closer and stripped the fabric from a spare length. The copper lay in his hands with the quiet readiness of a tool that will not offer enthusiasm but will honour use. He bent a short section around a dowel, not tight, not loose, a compromise learned from bending ribs and rails and the occasional stubborn mind. He held the curve near the cup's rim and watched steam bend to meet it, a thin, invisible thread choosing metal over porcelain as if brightness had weight. He whispered, "Come on, then." Not to the copper and not to the cup, but to the idea that kept circling him like a fox that didn't yet trust the yard. The first truck of the day coughed by and left the smell of diesel braided into the air. Somewhere a door slammed, a voice called a name. The base surfaced from the night in pieces and put itself together without fanfare. Hale drew the fuel path again from tanks to pump to carburetor, the familiar anatomy. Where the line ran coldest, he sketched the jacket, then stopped and erased the straight portions he had drawn without thinking. He replaced them with arcs, nothing decorative, only the smallest concessions to how heat likes to travel. He wrote "Don't force, invite." The words embarrassed him and then didn't. By 0610, the hangar doors rasped open to a wedge of chill. The crew chief stepped in with a roll of lagging under his arm and an expression that registered surprise at finding a man talking to a cup. "Lads are warming the carts," he said. "We'll do a Dawn whisper run on the first 4. Hale nodded, not moving his eyes from the drawing. "Good. Keep the vents cracked the first minute. Don't trap heat where it wants to be kind." He tapped the paper with the pencil. "I'm going to add a return curve on the jacket's far end. Nothing dramatic. Just," he groped for an honest word and found a small one, "gentle." The chief scratched his cheek with a thumbnail. "Gentle's not a word I hear much around here." "It will learn to serve," Hale said. He set the cup aside and built the small curve, 2 fingers worth of radius, a quiet turn where the jacket would otherwise spit heat out like a bad temper. He soldered with a soft flame, fed the bead until it bridged bright and smooth, then let the heat walk away at its own pace. He held the finished end against his wrist. Warmth persisted, not trapped, persuaded. "Try it with breath." The chief said half, mocking half, curious. Hale brought the curved end over the cup. Steam lifted, hesitated, and then traced the copper's inside edge, curling along it in a thin ribbon before rising. He didn't grin. He didn't claim magic. He only watched the invisible discover a road that felt like a promise kept. The sky brightened to the colour of old tin. Rain considered them, then declined. Hale plumbed the small curve into the bench rig, ran the warm loop across it, and cooled the fuel line below with a fresh bath that smoked like a tired ghost. The gauge climbed, trembled at a familiar threshold, and, where it would usually sigh and sag, held, not with bravado, with endurance. He wrote the time 06:43. Curved return installed. Needle holds through -26 test. He drew a small circle next to the note, not a victory mark, just the shape the morning seemed to be teaching him. He felt for the jacket with the blunt wisdom of a hand. The far end, where heat had once fled like a conscript, now gave a residue back to the line before taking its leave. He thought of a phrase from a lecture hall that had smelled of chalk and damp wool, boundary layer, convective darling. He had laughed at the man then without meaning to. He reached for that lost chalk now and wrote the grown-up words beneath the childish ones. Increase dwell, prefer laminar, curve for contact. He stripped the bandage, cleaned the split knuckles with iodine, hissed at the sting and wrapped them again. The sting woke the part of his mind that refused poetry. He turned to math. He wrote down the length of the jacket, the mass flow of the warm loop, the conductivity of copper he could expect given the quality in stores. He didn't chase decimals. He gave himself the big truths, more surface, more time, more kindness at the handoff. The rest the air would teach or refuse. By 07:20 the base had stacked itself into readiness. Boots went by with committed purpose. The mess sent out smells that reminded men of kitchens they had sat in without uniforms. Briggs walked in with the weather folded under his arm. Patchwork sky, the colonel said. Windows at 9 and again at noon. After that, green flak and black cloud. Hale tapped the board with the back of the pencil. Give me 20 minutes to bend these ends and bless the seams. Then I'll sign the paper you need. Briggs studied the small curve he had drawn over the long straight run. What is it? A way of saying please to heat. Hale answered. Briggs closed his eyes the smallest fraction, the way a man does when a word isn't wrong but isn't what he wants to carry into a briefing. Will it hold? It already has, Hale said. He did not raise his voice. Now we see if the air grudgingly agrees. The colonel nodded once and left with the weather still under his arm. Hale bent 3 more jacket ends to match the first. He polished their insides with emery until they caught light, as if they remembered summer. He tinned the lips, soldered the curve in with patience, and wiped the seams clean until his cloth came away almost white. Where the jacket touched the line, he laid a whisper of thermal paste, a grease that stank like a lie and behaved like a friend. The chief returned with 2 mechanics who had slept badly and moved well. They laid the first assembly on K9's spare line and tightened the bands in a series that made a private music. Click, pull, settle, click, pull, settle. Hale kept a hand on the curve and felt warmth travel into it and out of it without complaint. He considered where wind would roam once they were aloft and added a felt sleeve on the shadow side, not to stop cold but to slow it so the curve could do its gentle work. The cart screamed again, the prop bit again, the engine caught again. Idle, Hale said, and the engineer eased the lever as if the metal could feel courtesy. The jacket warmed like a memory returning. The needle didn't blink. Hold at 5 minutes, Hale said. Then run her up to a problem and see if she refuses. They did. The coil kept its counsel. The problem glanced, didn't recognize itself, and went looking for an easier target. Hale wrote the results down without using the word success. Those letters were cheap when men's lives were expensive. He returned to the bench and poured another inch of tea, only to watch it cool too quickly to be of use. He took the cup in both hands and cupped his breath into it, like a boy saving a moth from rain. Vapour rose and found the copper scrap again, the same easy path, the same affection for curve. He saw the map that had been in front of him for weeks and felt, finally, the shiver that comes when a riddle stops laughing at you. He slid the cup aside and threw himself at the plain work of making meaning real, lengthened the jacket another hand's width near the coldest span, relieved the clamp that had been tightened as if muscles could stop physics, add a bleed at the far end of the warm loop so heat wouldn't pool and sulk. None of it was elegant, all of it was precise. When the men came for him, it was with the solemn energy of people who have decided to believe. Briefings done. The runner said, "Crews are suiting. Group sent a captain to write your coil into a sentence. Tell him to spell it right." Hale said, and wiped the solder off his hands so he wouldn't leave fingerprints on whatever he had to sign. The captain was younger than he sounded and older than he looked. He wore his pen like a medal and his doubt like a tie. Field modification, he read as he wrote, fuel line heat, jacket, engineering certified, limited operational deployment pending further evaluation. Hale nodded, add, curved return to promote laminar dwell. The captain stared at him. In English, Hale glanced at the cup and the coil and chose mercy. Add, shaped end to keep warmth talking to the line longer. The pen hesitated, then obeyed, sign here. He said, and Hale did, his name sitting next to a drawing that would go into a folder and be filed under a number that would never say anything about Dawn or cups or grief. By 0902, the runway hummed. K9 rolled first into the corridor of weather that had opened like a mouth. 7 more followed, each carrying the coil under skin, patient as a second pulse. Hale stood at the edge of the apron with his headset around his neck, the cord trailing like an umbilical, and listened to the engines climb through his chest. He did not watch them all the way into distance. He went back inside, closed the hangar door to a crack, and put both hands on the bench until his shoulders stopped telling lies about being stone. He ran the rig again at the cold the weatherman had promised, and the sky had delivered, and he watched the needle behave as if the idea he had drawn on paper and soldered into metal had become a fact that no one would bother to argue with at dinner. The phone stayed quiet, the good kind of silence that makes you superstitious. He turned to the blackboard and wrote the words he would need later when the moment's music had faded. Curvature buys time, time buys flow, flow buys life. He underlined life once, and then erased the underline because he didn't want the wall to become a church. He took the cup again, held it up to the light, and saw the crack he had noticed days ago, tiny but certain, a hairline fault where heat had fled too quickly and left the material honest enough to show damage. He turned the cup and the steam found the other side, the side whole enough to carry comfort for one more morning. He set it down softly and wrote, edges break first, curve distributes insult. The sentence felt like both engineering and ethics. A messenger arrived with a sheet in his hand, an apology in his mouth. Command wants the miracle explained in 20 words. He said, Hale didn't look up. Tell them we gave heat a better path and asked it to be generous on the way. The messenger blinked. That many words cut the poetry on delivery, Hale said, and handed him a clean copy with the curve drawn without flair. He spent the next minutes making small changes that would never be recorded. A strap repositioned the width of a matchbook, a burr filed to keep wind from turning its whisper into complaint, a note to the night shift about how not to twist the return so tight that the curve forgot what ease felt like. He tightened the jacket on the training rig so young mechanics would learn the shape by hand, not just by sight. He paced the hangar once, twice, 3 times, like a man listening for a sound only he could hear and then trying to forget he had expected it. At 10:11, the radio cracked, weather, not human, and shrugged into silence. He pressed the cups tighter to his ears until the world sounded like ocean inside a shell. He heard names, numbers, places folded into coordinates, and the one word you hang a day on, holding. He set the headset down gently and let breath return unannounced. The chief came in, shook his cap over the concrete and glanced at the board. You've drawn a teacup in code, he said. Hale rubbed a thumb across the chalk and left a clean smear. I've drawn what steam taught me. The chief pursed his mouth. Steam and copper and stubbornness, he said. It's a religion I could almost join. Don't, Hale said. We need you practical. The day shifted underfoot, the way days do when waiting loosens its jaw and reveals hunger. Hale returned to the bench because work can be a prayer if you keep your head down. He built a smaller curve for the training rig, one exactly quarter, scale, so the apprentices could see how a gentle end favors contact. He ran a candle beneath it, a boy's experiment dressed in a man's need, and watched smoke trail the inside arc. When he exhaled toward it, the smoke clung harder to the curve, as if being asked kindly had made it eager to comply. He wrote, kindness scales. then stripped the word kindness and replaced it with geometry. It meant the same thing and wouldn't get him laughed out of a room. By noon, clouds dropped their bellies lower and rubbed the base with weather that wouldn't commit to one form. Hale ate what the mess handed him, a heel of bread and a stew that could have come from any latitude, without tasting it. He drank water that had learned the shape of the cup long ago. He listened for the phone to become a voice and refused to look at it while it was only a machine. He took the logbook to the bench and read backward over the last week as if retracing footsteps might explain how he had arrived at the door where the answer had waited. 208 hold transfer. Coax, he had written those words as if they were fence posts. Today they made a road. In the quiet next to noon, he allowed the thought he had held off because he did not want to tempt anything. A path from waste heat at the engine to the jacket that cradled the line. A return that curved not to impress but to linger. The easiest shapes favoured so the invisible would cooperate. Without complaint, no pumps added, no new miracles asked of men already offering enough. The phone rang at 12:17. He lifted the receiver as if it were a bird. The voice coming through sounded like rain heard through brick. K9 reports steady pressure at 18,000. The operator read no anomalies, returning to course. The next line was quieter, wing reports similar. Hale didn't close his eyes, he didn't move at all. He said, "Copy," and set the handset down with the care you give a sleeping infant. He rested his bandaged knuckles on the bench and let the noise in his skull settle into a single tone that belonged to relief and not to victory. He could feel the temptation rise, the urge to call it solved, to carve pride where steadiness should stand. He resisted it the way you refuse a drink when you have work to do with your hands. He returned to the board, circled the curve, and wrote the sentence he would want to find if someone else had done this and he were coming upon it cold and frightened. If the cold steals speed, buy time for heat. Buy it with curve. The base moved in slow, deliberate strokes through the after, lunch hour. The medics aired bedding in shy sun. The mechanics cleaned tools to keep from checking the clock. Someone in the next bay cursed a bolt that had decided to marry itself to its hole for life. Hale sharpened the pencil and dulled it again on purpose so his numbers would resist the theatrics of fine points. He wrote to the night shift as if he were writing to the future. Do not shorten the curve for neatness. Do not straighten it for speed. Do not starve the return. Let the jacket be a hand. He folded the instruction sheet, slipped it into a sleeve protector, and tacked it above the bench where eyes had learned to go without being told. A small voice in his head pointed to the simplicity of it all and made trouble. A teacup, a breath. He answered the voice with the fatigue of a man who has flown at least a little and has watched oil freeze in a spoon. If the shape is right, the source doesn't matter. He thought of the professor's chalk snapping, of the classroom window fogging in January, of his own breath on a train to posting, of the coil under a wing in a sky that disliked comfort. Every image bent to the same curve. He stepped outside and walked the line of modified planes. The copper was invisible beneath the panels now. The coil had become part of the machine, the way a lesson becomes part of a man. He touched the fuselage of each with a knuckle, the old superstition engineers pretend they do not believe in. The metal gave him back its cold and kept its quiet promises. When he reached K9's bay, he stopped. A smear of grease near the access panel told a small story about a hand that had slipped and then corrected. He ran a cloth over it, not for cleanliness, but to remove a sentence he did not want anyone to misread. He leaned in to look at the jacket again, even though he knew every bend by heart. The curve held its modest arc. He left it alone, the highest form of trust. A jeep barked at the door and died. Briggs climbed out, eyes narrowed against a wind that hadn't decided whether to insult or ignore. "News from group," he said. "They want your drawing recopied cleanly and sent with the evening dispatch. They want a name for it, too. Paper likes labels." Hale glanced at the board where chalk curves outnumbered straight lines for the first time. He considered the arrogance of naming a thing while men were in the air because of it. Call it a heat, jacket, curved return. He said, The rest is vanity." Briggs nodded. "Vanity doesn't fly, I've noticed." He stepped closer to the bench and saw the cup, the rim beaded with sweat from hot poured into cold. "Is this where it came from?" he asked, almost gentle. Hale took a breath that went down crooked and came up straight. "It's where it showed me it had been there all along." The colonel put a hand on his shoulder, brief and firm, the gesture of a commander and a friend wearing the same coat. "We'll see what the math says when the planes come back." They didn't talk about the other possibility. Afternoon stretched thin and sang at a high pitch only the tired can hear. Hale kept moving to keep dread from finding a chair. He inventoried what would be needed if group said more: copper lengths, bands, paste, cloth, time measured in hands and hours, and how much weather could be persuaded to hold still. He wrote requisitions with honest numbers that made the quartermaster blanch and sign anyway. At 14:58, the radio's tone changed. The subtle shift from outbound to homeward, not triumph, not even relief, just a vector toward bread and beds. Hale stood at the edge of the hangar and listened to the engines arrive before he could see shapes on the horizon. He did not count them until they were near, and even then he didn't do it twice, because double. Checking can taste like pleading. Wheels touched. Brakes found their old arguments with momentum. Men climbed down and laughed with the thin, bewildered joy of the reprieve. In the gallery of walkways along the bays, someone cheered and then caught himself. The coil said nothing. It hadn't learned to brag. Mason crossed the tarmac and stopped close enough that Hale could see salt dried on his collar. "It held," he said simply. "At 19, we heard the old whisper go looking for a door. It found a wall instead." "What about frost?" Hale asked. Mason's smile was a smaller thing than teeth. "It stayed on the outside where it belongs." He took a breath like a man tasting fruit he hadn't been able to afford. "Arthur, we flew the line as if it had remembered its job." Hale felt something unclench that he had not even recognized as a fist. He nodded once and couldn't help letting his eyes fall to the bandaged hand, the tease. Stained cup still on the bench, the chalked curve that was neither poetry nor law and both. He wrote down Mason's words. The exact ones. He put the time next to them. He underlined nothing. The crews drifted away to debriefings that would turn air into sentences and sentences into paper and paper into boxes that no one would open in time to matter. Hale stayed with the bench because the bench had not learned bureaucracy. He drew the jacket once more, this time with the curved end enlarged. A teacher's diagram for night classes. He would begin after supper if the weather held, if men were willing, if fatigue didn't take what it was owed. He wrote at the bottom of the drawing, smaller than the rest, "The world prefers curves it can live with." He put a line through world and wrote heat over it. He left the first word half, visible, like the past under a fresh coat of paint. The day's light thinned to a wire. The sky cooled from tin to iron. Briggs came in with a sheaf of approvals and a look that said he had argued hard, lost some, won enough. "They want 16 installs by week's end," he said. "They'll send copper if they can find it. If they can't, we'll steal it from places that don't mind being colder." Hale nodded. "We'll teach the curve to other hands." He didn't know yet that teaching would be the hardest part, not because men were unwilling, but because most of them had learned to make their bodies straight to endure what could not be bent. He would have to show them how curve isn't weakness. It's wisdom. He washed the bench down, the old ritual of drawing a line under a page before turning it. He rinsed the cup and set it upside down to dry, the crack at the rim catching a last drop and holding it like a memory of hurry. He turned out the lamp, then turned it back on, then off again, as if the light itself needed saying goodnight twice. Outside, the airfield exhaled a long, steady breath into the dark. Engines ticked as they cooled. Tires remembered their shapes. The gramophone in the mess found a tune that didn't pretend to heal. Men ate. Men wrote. Men closed their eyes and let the day stand guard for a while. Hale stood in the doorway for a span of heartbeats and let the cold bite his cheeks clean. He looked at the line of planes and saw not silhouettes but arteries. He looked at the hangar and saw not a building but a chest rising and falling. He looked at the cup and saw not a cup but the curve that had waited for him every morning of his life. He whispered to the absent professor, to the men with grease on their hands, to the pilots who had learned how to make courage sound like instruction. "I see it now." He didn't add thank you. The knight had already heard. He closed the door softly and left the lamp burning for the few minutes it takes courage to decide to be courage again. He didn't call the idea his. He didn't call it anything at all. He would let the work name it when it was ready. He didn't know it yet, but before midnight the curve would meet its first true enemy, not cold, not doubt, but haste, and he would have to decide whether to protect the shape or surrender it to speed. Afternoon thinned into a pale wash of light. Hale turned the cup in his hands once more and set it near the edge of the bench, as if the rim itself were a compass. Steam no longer rose. The lesson had already been given. The curve on the blackboard waited like a road unrolled across a continent, simple, almost arrogant in its neatness. He checked the jacket on the training rig, pressed 3 fingertips to the return, and felt warmth pass through copper as if the metal had learned a new language overnight. A runner appeared with breath-stitching ribbons in the cold. "Command wants a demonstration at 1600, he said. 2 observers from group, paper men. Hale nodded. Paper could be kind if you handed it the right truth. He wiped the solder bloom from a seam, straightened the chalk line he'd drawn too quickly, and laid out the rig with the ceremony of a field surgeon. Valve, gauge, bath, coil, bleed. The crew chief watched with arms folded, jaw ticking. Impatience and loyalty in equal measure. "They'll ask if it's safe," the chief said. "It isn't safe," Hale answered. "It's necessary." The 2 officers arrived without their coats unbuttoned. They smelled faintly of London. A different cold, a different kind of soot. Hale walked them through the rig in plain sentences. He did not say teacup. He did not say breath. He said curve, dwell, return, exchange. When the needle held through the plunge into the bath and the jacket's far end stayed warm enough to read by, one officer grunted approval in a language that had little grammar but perfect meaning. "How many airframes can you reach by week's end?" he asked. 16. Hale said, "More if we steal copper from luxuries." "Define luxuries," the man said, already knowing, "anything that keeps hands comfortable but doesn't keep engines alive." Pens scratched. Approval lived in the shape of a signature, nothing more radiant than ink obeying pressure. They left the hangar colder than they'd entered, taking with them the sentence that would give the curve a future. Evening drew down with purpose. The mess hall breathed stew and smoke. The gramophone lost a fight with static and tried again. Mechanics paired off at bays under lamps that made small suns in the dark. Hale divided the teams the way you divide a song. Melody to the men with patience, rhythm to the men with speed. He placed himself where the line bent hardest and the story could go wrong fastest. He taught by touch. He pressed a palm to the jacket and a knuckle to the line, and made the distance between them an argument resolved by copper. "Not tight," he murmured. "Earn the contact, don't bruise it." He guided a young mechanic's hands at the clamp. "If you overtalk, the curve will remember the insult and pay you back at altitude." The boy flushed and loosened a quarter turn. "Feels like cheating to be gentle," he said. "It's the only way the laws forgive you," Hale replied. They worked through the first 2 installations without drama. The third dragged a stubbornness into the bay. The spare jacket for that ship had been cut on a bad template, straightened where it should bend, trimmed where it must not. Hale held the piece against the drawing and felt irritation push up behind his eyes like a headache. Haste had found them all charm and sharp elbows. "Leave it," the chief said. "We'll shape a fresh one." "We'll shape this one," Hale said and turned the torch low. He annealed the copper until it blushed like something alive, then eased the curve back into it with a wood form and patience that tasted like penance. When he set it against the line again, the jacket settled with a sigh that wasn't sound at all, only fit. Midnight brought a pause, the way ocean takes a breath between surges. The wind changed key. Snow began its quiet work, dusting edges, softening angles. Hale's bandage had darkened where the knuckles wept. He ignored it. He checked the bleed at the far end of a return and found a drop clinging like a reluctant thought. He tightened the cap and imagined the drop shaking itself off somewhere over Belgium, not here, not now. Through it all, the cup waited on the ledge, a simple, cracked witness. He envied its certainty. Around one, the base settled into the strange silence of heavy work performed well. Wrenches clicked, breath steamed. Someone cursed softly and apologized to nobody. Hale moved from bay to bay and found, to his surprise, that the curve travelled well from his hands to theirs. Once men felt what the jacket wanted, their bodies obliged. The practical can be as devout as any creed when the creed delivers survival. On the 7th installation, fatigue made its first proper mistake. A return line took a sharper bend than the drawing allowed. It didn't kink, not visibly. It only tightened where ease had been prescribed. Hale saw it and felt annoyance fork into two unhealthy branches, one called tolerate, the other rework tomorrow. He cut both off. Back it out, he said, again. The mechanic's mouth opened with a complaint and closed with a swallow. Understood. They warmed the line and asked it to learn a better radius, Copper agreed. It often does when asked instead of driven. By 2:30, the last jacket for the night lay in place. The coil hugged the line as if adopting it. Hale tested each bleed. He brushed the paste thinner along a seam that had asked for too much and now had to learn what enough meant. He marked a small cross near a flange where frost would test them hardest, and wrote the word watch with a grease pencil. Morning would recognize the warning even after the letter faded. Exhaustion came not as a collapse, but as a flattening of ambition. Hale felt it in the way his thoughts turned from choreography to triage. He refused to let that become the night's master. He drank water, then more. He took bread he didn't want and chewed until it agreed to be part of him. He washed the rag and wrapped his hand again. The iodine pinched a clean pane into the hour. The crew chief leaned against the bulkhead and stared at the chalked curve. You ever think about names? He asked. Men like to bless inventions with syllables. Hale shook his head. Names put men on the front of books. Curves keep engines alive. I'll keep the curve. You'll get a line in a report at least, the chief said. Small print maybe too. I'll take a thin line, Hale said, if it means I don't write any more letters this week. They both went quiet, the word letters stretched between them like wire in frost. Snow thickened and then thought better of it. The gramophone died, the bulbs hummed. Time behaved both quickly and slow, as it does when work and fear share the same plate. Hale moved to the bench and drew the curve again from muscle memory. Arc, dwell, return, home. He penciled a little note beneath it that no one would see. You found me in a cup. I forgive the world for that. Near 4, the weather officer stuck his head in, cheeks bitten red. Window at 7, he said. Narrow, after that the sky will close its fist. 7 will do, Hale said. He walked the row one last time. He put a hand to each panel where the new jacket hid and listened with his skin. He had no right to claim the old superstition, but he took it like a borrowed coat anyway. At each touch, he heard the same vow repeated in different accents. Hold, hold, hold. He believed it, or he chose to. Dawn slipped its grey blade under the door. The bass woke not with trumpets, but with the low argument of engines asked to be loyal again. Hale carried the training rig to the corner and ran the demonstration a final time for the men who had missed the nightly sermon. He watched their eyes change when the needle refused to fall. He liked that change. It wasn't triumph. It was responsibility. Mason came early, cap tilted back, the look of a man who had gambling in his blood and was tired of gambling on luck. He shook Hale's bandaged hand and peered into an access panel with the intimacy of a priest checking the altar. Looks honest, he said. It is. Hale replied. Honesty has to be. Lies freeze faster. Mason leaned closer. Feels different, too, the tone when you tap it. He rapped twice with a knuckle, a musician's ear listening for a key. More settled. Curve adds a harmony, Hale said. He didn't mean it as poetry, but it sounded like it, and neither of them apologized. In the briefing hut, maps lost their color under winter's glare. The operations officer tapped a route that knifed into cloud and out again, as if daring whether to argue. Men took notes without looking down. Hale stood at the back, small in the ridge of shadow where responsibility likes to stand, and repeated the instructions he'd written. Vent early, watch the far seam, don't muscle the bleed. He kept his voice low. The work was done. Loudness would only scare the living idea away. Wheels rolled at 7:05. Hale walked beside K9, hand on metal until the moment came when letting go is not symbolic but mandatory. The prop arcs beat wind into shape. The field vibrated with the vast one. Note him of engines deciding to live. The runway shortened, the tail lifted, gravity reconsidered its case, and the bomber rose. Hale watched the coil fly without seeing a single inch of it. He stood very still until the plane became line, then smudge, then sound. Inside the hangar, silence emptied itself over the benches. He cleaned the tip of the torch, though no flame would be needed for an hour. He made tea, though he would only taste the first mouthful. He drew the curve again, not because he had forgotten it, but because his hand liked the reminder. Redundant ritual is how the mind refuses panic. 10 minutes, 20, 40. Hale rewound the night in his head the way a man fingers a rosary he doesn't admit to owning. He found again the moment haste had offered him an easier lie and the place where he had said no. He felt gratitude for that refusal like heat returning to a numb hand. Painful, necessary proof of life. The phone rang. He didn't startle. He lifted the receiver and said his name the way a man introduces himself to fate. The operator read from a strip of paper. K9 holding steady at 14, climbing to 18, pressure smooth. Crew reports no frost inside. Hale closed his eyes for a heartbeat he counted too carefully, then opened them to the work that still wanted him. He set the phone down and wrote the line in his logbook exactly as delivered. He did not underline. He did not add adjectives. He wrote smooth and let it be. Time scraped forward on the rough edge of waiting. Crews checked wrenches they didn't need to check again. A dog bone, white and disreputable, curled under a wing and slept like a poem nobody had published. Hale checked the paste can and closed it tighter. He checked the wire reel and straightened its tail. The body will invent tasks to give the soul a place to stand, at 9, weather lifted enough to let horizon be horizon again. Hale stepped into the light and let it write a thin warmth across his cheekbones. Engines were far away but friendly. He turned back to the blackboard, erased the smudges, redrew the curve so clean it looked inevitable, and under it wrote what he had learned and would now force himself to keep learning. Do not rush what must be gentle. Do not hesitate where boldness keeps men alive. The radio cracked, fluttered, held. Hale walked toward the sound and stopped halfway like a man deciding not to ruin a good dream by moving. A voice, Mason's but flattened by distance and duty, came through. K9 at 19, systems nominal, no anomalies. He allowed himself one smile that no one saw. It felt unsteady, like a child walking on a wall, but it stayed up. He returned to the bench, picked up the cup and breathed across its rim as if he were blessing it. He thought of the line under the panel doing work without applause. He thought of the men sitting behind it, faces wind, burned, hearts at that strange steady pitch bravery picks when it is done pretending to be something else. At 10:30, the first dots found the edge of the world and moved inward. Hale counted them wrong, then right, then wrong again. Counting is the only arithmetic with a soul, and it is rarely accurate. Wheels touched, flaps sighed, tires coughed. Men climbed down with the eyes of creatures stepped through fire and found their feet on the other side. Mason reached earth and looked at Hale, not grinning, not solemn, only present in a way that made presence feel like grace. She held, he said, at 19, at 20. The old whisper came bolder this time and found no purchase. We gave it nowhere to die. What did you hear? Hale asked. A hum that sounded like breathing, Mason said, and clapped a glove against the panel as if thanking an animal for letting him ride. Reports gathered themselves out of voices and ink. Briggs collected them with the humility of a man who knows paper isn't victory, but can carry it without spilling. He pulled Hale aside beneath a leaking gutter that had remembered how to drip. Group is recommending expansion. He said, copper promised by morning, they want a short manual, keep it crude and clear. Hale's mind had already built it in the margins. Photographs with circles where circles mattered, arrows with verbs. A sentence at the top that said curved return mandatory. Do not improvise straight. He nodded, we'll print by midnight, he said. He returned to the bench and began to write. He chose words like tools, blunt, faithful, incapable of showing off. Step 1. Anneal jacket ends to prevent crack at bend. Step 2, fit curve to line by hand, no flats. Step 3, apply thin thermal paste only on contact arcs. Step 4, vent warm loop gently, do not trap heat. Step 5, verify far. End dwell by feel, it should be warm, not hot. He drew a sketch of the curve with one dotted line showing the wrong way. Straight, fast, fatal. The apprentices gathered like birds on a wire, reading over his shoulder and arguing in quiet pride about who had folded the neatest strap, who could bend without scar. Hale let them argue. Pride has uses when it wears overalls. Afternoon came dressed in sleet. The base shook itself and made more room for the possible. The quartermaster rolled in copper lengths on a cart that squealed its ailments without shame. Hale counted, did fast math, wrote numbers on the board, and underlined the reality that always steals sugar from good news, hours. The coil saved engines. Time still had to be cut into pieces men could carry. They worked as light drained from windows and pooled on floors. Lamps rose to meet the dark. Hale taught until instruction became reflex. He held a young mechanic's wrist and slowed it, not because youth was careless, but because speed is a kind of fear dressed as confidence. Let warmth speak into the line, he said, don't shove it. By evening they had doubled the count. 16 jackets installed, bled blessed. The manual ran off the duplicator with a thrum that smelled like ink and fresh decisions. Briggs took the first stack and pressed his palm against it the way you check a chest for breath. Good, he said, which from him meant everything a louder word could not. Hale sat for the first time since dawn. The stool recognized him and creaked. He placed the cup on the ledge, watched the rim catch a bead of water from the roof's slow leak, and saw the drop choose, never straight down, always along the curve until gravity became persuasion. He thought of how many small choices like that lived inside every machine, every man, every day of this war. He thought of how survival might not be courage amplified, but ease offered in the right place at the right time. The door opened and Winter stepped in with the smell of coal smoke and wool. Mason leaned against the frame, eyes bright from weather and wakefulness. They're calling it your trick, he said, in the mess, the crazy curve, the teacup thing. Hale shook his head. It isn't mine, he said. It belongs to Heat. Mason smiled. Then Heat owes you a drink. Hale allowed himself laughter, small but unbroken. It warmed him better than tea. He stood, joints arguing, and looked once more along the row of planes that had learned a new habit. He felt the night's temper hold steady, the storm biding time out beyond the hedgerows, and the day's work sitting inside metal like a candle that refused wind. He cleaned the bench, not because order was needed, but because order had become a prayer he trusted. He capped the paste, coiled the wire, hung the torch where it could see the door. He closed the logbook on another page dense with handwriting that tried to outrun loss and sometimes did. When he switched off the lamp, the hanger let the dark return without argument. He stood a moment longer to let his eyes learn the outlines he already knew. The shadow of a ladder, the rectangle of the rig, the square of the blackboard with its gentle curve, chalked so clean it could have been carved there by weather. He touched the cup's cracked rim and felt the coolness that had started everything. He stepped into the corridor of night and listened to the field brie, a low, confident sound, somewhere between a whisper and an oath. Behind him, copper remembered warmth. Ahead of him, the sky remembered its tricks. Between the two, a man walked with hands that smelled of iodine and metal, and a mind that had finally found a shape the cold would respect. He didn't know it yet, but the next dawn would bring suspicion as sharp as flak. Questions from men who confused miracle with shortcut, who would ask the curve to be quicker, cheaper, straighter. He would have to choose whether to defend kindness with ferocity. And in that choice, everything waiting in the dark began to turn. April 1943, just before dawn. The wind came in hard from the fens, thin as wire, singing along the hangar seams. Hale unlocked the side door with fingers that still smelled of iodine and solder. He paused in the threshold and listened. The base breathed the wary, restless breath of men who had slept only because darkness insisted. Somewhere, a kettle began its small, brave boil. Somewhere else, a truck coughed itself into obedience. He stepped inside and found the bench exactly as he'd left it. The logbook closed, the paste capped, the cup drying on its side with a single bead clinging to the cracked rim and refusing to choose a direction. The bead made up its mind at the same moment the phone rang. Engineering, he said. Group Ops. A level voice answered. Command review at 0600. Bring your drawings and your caution. The line clicked off. Hale set the receiver down and looked at the blackboard where the curve still made its quiet case. He straightened the chalks like cutlery and breathed in the smell of copper and coal and paper. Then he gathered what a room full of uniforms would respect: diagrams cleaned of fingerprints, simple numbers written like facts, and one sentence printed in a soldier's block hand. Curved return mandatory. Do not straighten. The room at Ops held the weather of other rooms: wet wool, old arguments, tobacco, that settled into corners and waited for men with polished shoes. Briggs stood at the far end, shoulders squared, hat under his arm. Beside him, two group officers Hale knew by reputation, and by the way they wore doubt as if it were part of the uniform. Hale laid the drawings flat. He did not bow to them, and he did not fight them. He only gave them the curve. The taller officer spoke first. We've read your field reports. We've seen the test hop. We acknowledge improved pressure stability. He let the word acknowledge sit in the air like cold tea. What we have not seen are the risks fully stated. Hale leaned in. The risks are the same as the old risks. If the warm loop leaks, we lose a cup of comfort and fix it on the ground. If the line freezes, we lose a crew we cannot replace. The curve buys time. Time buys flow. Copper supply is finite, the second officer said, and your men are not infinite. You propose to route heat from existing waste. What does the engine lose? What it wasted yesterday, Hale said, and will always waste unless we ask it to be generous. The taller officer peered at him. Pilot error remains on the table. Pilots are men, Hale said, careful with tone. The cold is not. I prefer to negotiate with physics. A silence opened. Briggs filled it with the gravel of his voice. We'll trial 8 more. We'll accept the consequence if they fail, but we will not accept arrears in courage. The signatures came the way winter comes, reluctant until suddenly it isn't, a stamp a second. Permission filtered through paper into motion. Hale gathered the drawings, the signed sheet, and the weight of expectation that travelled with them. As he turned to leave, the shorter officer called after him, "We will be watching, closely." "Good," Hale said without looking back. "So will we." The hangar became a factory of carefulness. Teams moved in practiced orbits. The first Lancaster of the day, K-9, waited with her panel open, ribs exposed, the old line visible as a spine. Hale slid in beneath and ran his hand along the jacket installed 2 nights ago. The curve had not forgotten its shape. He tightened a strap by the width of a thumbnail and felt the entire system settle, as if admitting to the small improvement and forgiving whatever had come before. Mason arrived with the weather on his cap and a smile that had learned how to be its own discipline. "They'll assign observers to ride," he said, "men who ask questions even when the answers are all noise." "They can ride," Hale replied. Noise is honest at altitude. In the bay next over, a mechanic named Arnott held a fresh jacket up to the light and scowled. "This one's shy," he said, feeling for the seam with a thumb, "won't sit." Hale took the piece, annealed the end until it softened, and whispered the curve back into it with a wood block and patience that could have been mistaken for tenderness. He handed it back, and Arnott nodded, something like pride loosening his jaw. "That's better," he said, "like it wants to help." By mid-morning the first 8 were finished. The cart shrieked, the props bit, engines caught, jackets warmed, needles held. A group captain with a notebook the size of a Bible recorded everything without once remembering to put his hat on straight. "Proceed," he said finally, and the word put fuel in men as surely as anything in the tanks. The briefing that day felt different, not lighter, nothing was light, but charged as if the room knew a decision had been made and all that remained was to prove it had not been foolish. Maps unfurled, pencils tapped. The operations officer traced a route at altitudes that had lately insulted them. The flag forecast hovered ugly over the target. The weather forecast pretended to be a friend. Hale stood at the back and said nothing. He had spent his words where they would buy most. On the apron, observers from group clipped in beside crew engineers with the politeness of men visiting a household that does not live like theirs. Hale climbed the ladder into K9 and took the jump seat again. Not because he trusted others less, but because he wanted to hear the coil sing under pressure. Mason settled into the left seat, eyes narrowed to just the right size, hands light on throttles that could be cruel if you forgot they were only levers. Mixture rich, Mason said, props full. He turned his head just enough for Hale to hear the smile. Let's see if your curve can argue with Germany. They rolled, the runway came toward them and then slid away. Lift spoke through the fuselage in a long, low vowel. They climbed into a sky that had learned how to be difficult without boasting. At 10,000 feet, the cold arrived, dignified, unimpressed. Hale put the back of his glove to the jacket. Warmth answered, pressure held. He wrote the minute down without ceremony. At 14, the old whisper came, thin as a rumour, familiar as a scar. Hale leaned in. The whisper met the curve and lost interest. At 18, Frost traced delicate fernwork across the outside of the window and stopped where the cabin's breath made a border. Holding, the engineer called. Holding, Mason echoed. Hale let air out of his lungs slowly, a man adjusting a promise to fit reality. They levelled at 19 and turned for the waypoint. Pestering flak wrote black punctuation in the distant sky, angry, bored, then angrier. The observers scribbled, one daring to ask, and if a jacket fails, then we fix it. Mason said before Hale could speak, on the ground, not in the obituaries. The trip back turned weather into mathematics. Airspeed and wind and time finding a brief harmony that let the field return itself to them. They put wheels on Earth. Brakes told truths. The plane settled with the grateful shiver of a body allowed to rest. On the tarmac, the captain with the notebook approached Hale with his skepticism carefully folded. Your heat, jacket held, he said. Commence conversion of remaining squadron assets as copper permits. Briggs met Hale outside the hangar with a jaw that knew good news but refused to grin in public. You have your window, he said. Don't waste it on perfect. Win with enough. So they did. The next days became a liturgy of curve and clamp and bleed and blessing. Teams worked in pairs that finished each other's sentences and sometimes each other's mistakes. Hale walked the bays with a pencil behind his ear and a softness in his voice that fooled no one. Imprecision did not survive long within the reach of those hands. And then the suspicion came, the kind that wears a courteous coat. 2 engineers from another field unit arrived with a case of calipers and the tired righteousness of men who had been living with a different problem. Your curve is overbuilt, one said, letting the word overcut, your dwell unnecessary. He tapped a drawing with a fingernail that had seen too many cigarettes. Straight run, short return, less copper, faster install will make your miracle tidy. Hale set the pencil down and looked at the man the way he would look at a bearing that had squealed for attention too long. A straight run invites heat to leave early, he said. A short return forgets that warmth is a guest you must walk to the door. The man smiled the way some men do when they suspect metaphor is a trap. War is not a salon. We don't walk guests anywhere. Men are not guests. Hale said softly, they are the house. The second engineer raised both hands, a performance of patience. We are not your enemy, he said. We are your speed. Command wants 20 installs by week's end. Give us the line, we'll make it simpler. Hale tasted the old coin of fear and did not move it to his cheek this time. He bit down, you'll make it faster, he said, then you'll make it fail. Briggs arrived mid-sentence, took in the temperature and cooled it with authority. Trial the straight return on one rig, he said. Not on an airframe. If the needle holds for 10 minutes in a bath at -30, we'll talk. If it flinches, this conversation ends. The men agreed because the colonel's voice did not offer a prettier alternative. They rigged the straightened version on the bench. They packed the bath with dry ice until fog crawled across the floor and made the hangar look like a stage. The pump hummed, the warm loop ran, the needle climbed, and Hale watched the telltale place. The seam where ease becomes force. The needle dipped, barely, enough. He tapped the gauge with a knuckle, not to coax it, but to test whether hope was interfering with vision. The dip remained. Again, Briggs said. They ran it again. The dip came earlier. They added lagging. The dip came anyway. Hale looked at the men with calipers and felt the sting of what he hated most to deliver. Told you so. He swallowed it. The curve isn't a flourish, he said. It's the difference between help and the pretense of help. The first engineer shrugged, pride sharp as shrapnel. You won this one, he said. Time will tell if you always do. Time, Hale said, is what the curve buys. The men left with their case and their measurements, and suspicion went with them, or at least stepped back to whisper from the doorway instead of the middle of the room. Hale didn't celebrate. He only turned to the board and wrote in small letters beneath the drawing, "Do not simplify what kindness has made exact." Afternoon fell away, bringing weather that smelled of ice and iron. The quartermaster rolled up with copper that had been stolen from somewhere sensible, a radiator that would spend a season cold so a cockpit could spend a mission alive. Hale signed the requisition without apology. War was arithmetic. He would not do it cruelly, but he would do it. He returned to K9 because habit is a kind of faith. He opened the panel, touched the jacket, checked the bleed, found a smear of paste where none should be, and cleaned it until the joint looked like it had been born neat. He wrote watch near a support that would chatter under certain crosswinds. He closed the panel with a hand that had become a gavel and a blessing. When he turned, Mason was there with a letter in his pocket and the tired contentment of a man who has flown a problem long enough to recognize a solution when it shakes his hand. "They're posting me to lead the test flight on the Berlin run," he said, as if naming a street. "Command wants to see the curve argue with the worst of it." Hale's mouth went dry. Berlin meant altitude and spite and cold that invented new ways to be cruel. "You'll take K9, if she'll have me," Mason said. He looked past Hale into the hangar where teams bent copper and bent themselves around patience. "They'll come for you if it fails," he added, not accusing, only accurate. "They'll come for me if it fails," Hale agreed. "And they'll be right." Mason put a hand on Hale's shoulder, brief as a heartbeat, then let's not let it fail. Night walked in wearing sleet. The gramophone found a song brave enough to survive static. The mess served something thick enough to make strength out of habit. Hale ate without tasting and worked without talking, bending and fixing and blessing until the hour thinned and the lamp turned the bench into a small island of day. He felt fear and did not pretend otherwise. He held it where it would not use him. Past midnight, a young mechanic, day barely shaving, approached with both hands open and an apology already rehearsed. "Sir," he said, "I cut the return a finger too short on L2. We can make it reach if we pull hard." "No," Hale said instantly. "Heat won't walk a road, you bully. Strip it and bend another." Day's mouth opened into the shape of dismay, but he nodded. "Understood." Hale watched him go. The boy's shoulders squared under a lesson few men like to learn, that the fastest path to failure is the one that feels almost right. He went back to the bench to draft the ugly drawing, a version of the manual that would insult no one with elegance and would forgive every greasy thumbprint. Arrows, circles, instructions written as commandments. Do not straighten the return. Do not shorten for neatness. Insist on curve, insist on dwell. Insist on kindness enforced by metal. He pinned it above each bay. He knew some would laugh at the last line. He let them. Just before 2, the sky broke and refroze, rain sharpening into pellets that ticked on the corrugated roof like typewriter keys. Hale stared at the cup on the ledge, a single drop forming where the leak in the gutter above had found a rhythm. The drop fattened, trembled, rolled along the rim's curve and fell exactly where gravity had negotiated with porcelain. He watched 3 more. He timed them. He felt foolish and then didn't. Rhythm is rhythm, whether in water or war. He went to the radio hut to leave a note with the operator. Flight test window at 0630. Coil inspection at 0510. K9 priority. The operator glanced up, eyes ringed with the purple honesty of exhaustion. They say you've put warmth on a leash, he said. I've given it a habit, Hale replied. Leashes break. Back in the hangar, the last jacket for the night married itself to a line without complaint. Hale ran the warm loop and felt the far end glow modestly against his palm. He didn't praise it. He turned the valve, watched the needle, and waited the extra minute that made good work great. The needle stayed faithful. He shut it down. He washed his hands at the cracked basin until the water ran mostly clear. He re-wrapped his knuckles. He wrote the day's last line in the logbook, 16 more. Curves obedient, straightened version failed bench abandon. He closed the book, set the pencil on top like a sentry, and let himself feel the brief mercy of a job not finished, but more finished than Dawn had dared to promise. Outside, the runway slept without trust. Inside, the hangar grew quiet enough for clocks to own the room. Hale sat finally and lifted the cup to his lips. The tea had gone cold. He drank it anyway. He put the cup down and listened to the emptiness it made, a tiny porcelain note. He smiled at that. Even quiet could sing. He rose to go and stopped at K9's nose. He touched metal with the back of his hand and said, not a prayer, not a wish, only a truth he meant to make real hold. He didn't know it yet, but the men he had argued with that morning would return at first light with one last demand dressed as a favor. Shorten the curve by one bend to save an hour per airframe, and in the answer he gave them would be the line between invention and negligence, between a miracle that endures and a trick that dies when watched. The next morning broke with an unnatural stillness, the kind that precedes either peace or catastrophe. Frost gripped every rivet, every cable, every inch of the airfield until even sound felt frozen in place. The horizon was a dull blade of silver, slicing through a sky that refused to warm. Arthur Hale walked across the tarmac with his collar high and his thoughts higher still, the logbook pressed beneath his arm like a sacred text. By 05:10, the hangar lights were awake, humming their fragile tune. Inside, the teams moved quietly, aware that this morning was heavier than most. K9, the veteran of countless tests, stood ready near the doors, her dark fuselage slick with rime, her engines waiting for the spark. Hale's breath plumed in front of him as he checked each jacketed line, running his hand along copper that still held the memory of nights cold. The curves gleamed faintly, smooth as river bends, perfect in their defiance of simplicity. Everything tight, Briggs asked behind him, his voice a low gravel. As tight as truth allows, Hale said. The colonel nodded, his eyes tracing the hangar floor where condensation had pooled and frozen into a thin sheet of ice. Group engineers are here, he said quietly. They want one last look before take-off, and they're already asking for faster installs. Hale turned. Faster means straighter, and straighter means dead. Briggs' expression softened, but did not yield. I know, but command doesn't deal in poetry, Arthur. They deal in minutes and copper. At the far end of the hangar, 2 officers entered, coats heavy with self-importance. They brought the kind of cold that didn't melt bureaucratic, calculated. The first one pointed toward the assembly line of coils and said, We've timed your men. The curved jacket takes 40, 6 minutes longer to fit than a straight run. That's half a squadron delayed for the week. Hale wiped his palms on a rag and faced them. And how long does it take to write a condolence letter? The silence that followed was brief but dense. Briggs stepped in, his authority measured. We're not debating that now, he said. Let's hear the proposal. The younger officer, sharp, eager, and blind, spread a blueprint on a crate. We shorten the curve here, he said, tracing the line with his pencil, 1 bend instead of 2. The heat still flows, but the path is faster. You save metal, you save time. Hale studied the drawing. The line on the page was clean, logical, deadly. You save time, he said softly. By stealing grace, the heat won't linger. It'll rush and leave the cold untouched. The officer straightened, his chin lifting. We're not building art, Mr. Hale. We're building war. And war kills enough on its own. Hale replied, his voice almost a whisper. We don't need to help it. Briggs cleared his throat. Arthur. But Hale wasn't finished. Do you know why the curve works? It isn't physics alone, it's patience. The line doesn't command the heat, it invites it. Straighten that invitation and the cold will answer first. The older officer folded his arms. You'll test both versions. Command will see which performs better. Hale nodded once. Fine, but we test them honestly. Side by side under the same sky. They agreed. 2 rigs were prepared that morning, one with Hale's perfect curve, one with the clipped compromise. Both would be run under identical pressure and temperature, their fuel lines plunged into freezing baths that mimicked high-altitude cold. At 06:30, the lamps dimmed and the test began. Steam rose from the warm loops, ghosting upward. Hale stood between the rigs, his eyes locked on the twin gauges. Both needles climbed, both steadied. For the first 3 minutes, the numbers looked identical. Steady flow, perfect pressure. The officers exchanged glances that smelled like victory. At minute 4, the clipped line began to murmur, a faint rattle, a hesitation in the pump. Hale heard it first, before the gauge flinched. He leaned in close, watching the pressure twitch downward by half a division, then another. Within seconds, the whisper became a stutter. The frost that had begun at the far end of the pipe crept forward, silvering the copper like slow disease. The needle fell. Shut it down, Hale said quietly. The younger officer frowned. It's still running. Shut it down. The pump choked once and died. Silence swallowed the hanger. Then Hale turned to the second rig. The original curve. The same fuel, the same bath, the same time. The needle held as steady as breath. Frost had formed on the outside, yes, but never inside. The line was alive. Hale said nothing. He didn't need to. Briggs let out a breath he'd been holding for minutes. There's your answer, he said. The younger officer's face burned red. We'll need confirmation. More trials. Hale stepped closer, his words calm but sharpened by exhaustion. You don't need trials, you need humility. The officer turned to Briggs. If we'd started sooner, more crews could be flying by now. And if we'd started your way, Briggs said, none of them would be coming back. That ended the meeting. When the officers were gone, the hangar seemed to exhale. The men returned to work with quiet purpose. Hale sat at the bench and opened his logbook, his handwriting slower now, each letter deliberate. Straightened variant failed. Thermal decay at 4:12. Maintain full curve integrity. No exceptions. He underlined the last 2 words until the paper bruised. Outside, the horizon blushed with reluctant light. Engines began warming across the field, their deep, rhythmic thunder rolling across the fog. Today's mission was heavier than most, Berlin again. The city's defences had grown cruel. Every pilot knew the odds. Every mechanic knew the stakes. Mason approached, gloves tucked under his arm, the cold pinking his face. We're cleared, he said, K9's taking lead. Hale looked up from his notes. You'll have the new observers again. Mason smirked, 2 of them, both convinced they'll write history before breakfast. Make sure they live long enough to finish the paragraph. Mason laughed softly. You'll be here when we're back. Where else would I be? The laughter died, replaced by something quieter, an understanding without words. Mason reached out, gripped Hale's shoulder once, then turned and walked toward the plane. His boots left prints in the frost, clear and dark, until the engines drowned everything. Hale followed him out, stopping a few paces from the wing. The wind whipped his coat as Mason climbed the ladder. The crew moved with rehearsed urgency. Fuel, ammunition, final checks, 1,000 details honed into routine. Yet beneath the efficiency, there was reverence. Each man touched metal before stepping away, as if acknowledging the machine's fragile mercy. When Mason signaled ready, Hale gave a thumbs up, no speech, no prayer, just the gesture of a man sending his hope skyward. Engines roared to life, deep, hungry, alive, the air filled with vibration. K9 began to move, lumbering down the runway like a beast waking from winter. The other bombers followed, their propellers carving light through mist. Hale's heart thudded in time with their rhythm. One by one, the aircraft lifted, their bellies flashing silver against the dawn, then vanished into cloud. He stood there long after the noise faded, the cold biting through his coat, the smell of fuel heavy in his lungs. Behind him, Briggs approached slowly. You should get warm, the colonel said. Not yet. Hale's eyes stayed fixed on the sky. They'll hit 20,000 before the hour's over. That's where the frost tries its tricks. Briggs nodded, silent. Minutes bled into an hour. The hangar clock ticked with indifferent precision. Hale paced, checked the gauges on the test rig for the 100th time, wrote numbers that didn't need writing, listened for the phone that hadn't rung. Outside, the day brightened to a brittle blue. Somewhere up there, his curve was fighting physics in real time, holding its breath against the cold. At 09:17, the line finally buzzed. Hale snatched the receiver before the second ring. "Base engineering," he said. Static filled his ear. Then Mason's voice, faint but steady. "Arthur, it's holding. We're at 20,000, no frost. Pressure stable." Hale closed his eyes. The hangar spun, then steadied, and the others, all steady. Mason said, "One of the observers asked why it isn't freezing. I told him we stopped forcing the heat to work like a soldier. We let it dance like a man." A laugh escaped Hale before he could stop it. "Just bring it home, Mason." "We'll try," Mason said. "Tell Briggs his gamble paid off." The line went dead. Hale stood there for a long moment, the phone still in his hand, the echo of Mason's words alive in the static. Then he set it down gently, almost reverently. By midday, the base was trembling again. The first waves of returning bombers crawling out of the horizon, smoke trailing like old memories. One by one, they landed, battered, scorched, wounded but breathing. Hale counted them without realizing he was counting aloud. 17, 18, 19. Then the last shape emerged through the haze. K9, the landing was rough. The tires bit, skidded, caught. The engines coughed in exhaustion. The plane rolled to a halt in front of the hangar. The crew descended, faces streaked with soot and relief. Mason came last, helmet under his arm, grin too tired to finish. "She held," he said simply. The curve held. Hale wanted to answer, but words failed him. He just nodded once. The crew filed past. The observers, pale and shaken, mumbled their thanks to nobody in particular. Briggs approached, clapped Hale on the back, and said, "You've done something more than clever, Arthur. You've done something human." Hale didn't smile. He just looked up at the sky, the same indifferent blue, now torn by contrails, and whispered, "We only gave warmth a place to stay." That night, the airfield was quiet. The men who'd flown were still alive. The men who hadn't spoke softer because of it. The gramophone played something gentle, and for once, nobody complained about the scratches. In the hangar, Hale sat alone at his bench. The cup was where it always was, its crack a white scar under lamplight. He poured the last of the tea, watched the steam curl in its old familiar path, and thought of the copper curves hidden inside steel miles above. He took a slow sip and smiled, not out of pride but relief. He opened his logbook and wrote the day's final entry. 20 bombers returned, all engines stable, the curve endures. He closed the book. The lamp hummed. The cold outside receded a little, as if conceding temporary defeat. Arthur Hale leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the sound of distant engines settling to silence remind him that sometimes, against all odds, warmth could win. He didn't know it yet, but success would bring a new kind of danger, not the kind measured in altitude or frost, but in envy. Word of Hale's curve would travel faster than the truth of it, and the same men who doubted him would now fight to own the miracle they had once tried to simplify. And through it all, Hale would discover that the hardest battle was not against the cold of the sky, but the cold of men. April 1943, 05:52. The field held its breath while men learned their checklists by muscle more than memory. The frost had come back during the night and written its pale script across every wing and window, but the jackets beneath the panels held a quieter story. Warmth set on its path, a promise taught in copper. Arthur Hale stood beside K9 with his gloves tucked under one arm, eyes running the line of rivets, the way a physician reads a pulse. The curve he had argued into existence lay hidden and ordinary, an unspectacular grace ready to do unspectacular work. Mixture set, props full. Mason called from the ladder, voice clipped and easy. "We climb gentle, we live longer." Hale touched the access panel with 2 fingers. Habit, superstition, gratitude. and stepped back as the starter cart screamed alive. One prop bit, then another, and the engines came up in overlapping harmonies that pushed the night back an inch at a time. The runway gleamed with a varnish of melt and refreeze. Men waved their small, serious signals. The tower's lamp threw its cone, a clean permission in a dirty war. They rolled. The runway strobed through the wheel wells, the tail lifted, the field let go. The first 100 feet felt like the last time a man might change his mind. Then the earth fell obediently away, and the sky took custody. Hale closed his eyes for half a second and let the engine note crawl through bone. It sounded even. It sounded honest. It sounded like a promise that knew better than to boast. They stepped through cloud and into air that forgot spring had ever existed. At 6:00, the cold announced itself with a polite ache along the cheekbones. At 10:00, breath thinned and the cabin metal became an instrument. Tiny pings and ticks as temperature taught it a harsher key. Hale reached for the panel and laid the back of his glove against the jacketed line. The warmth there did not strut. It simply endured. He wrote the time down with a pencil that left reluctant lead on freezing paper. 14. The engineer called. The old whisper tried its trick. Thin, insinuating, familiar as regret. Hale leaned in, listening the way you listen at a door you have sworn not to open. The whisper met the curve and had nowhere to settle. It slid away into the return like a rumour denied oxygen. The needle did not blink. Mason gave a small, private nod to no one in particular and trimmed the climb a hair, a pilot's way of touching wood. The formation levelled, then climbed again in steps the flak forecasts had dictated. Skip ceilings and corridors of cruel air threaded between angry altitudes. Outside the window, dawn folded itself into a glare with no warmth. The world below lost its names and became a quilt of fields and roads and rivers that no one up here could afford to love. The navigator marked their waypoints with the quiet concentration of a man slotting keys into locks. In the intercom, voices travelled flat and useful. Anything decorative had been left on the ground. 19,000. The cabin smell shifted from oil and canvas to metal and cold breath. Frost feathered the outer pane in delicate fernwork and stopped where the cabin's small Mercy held its line. Hale tracked the needle, steady. He placed a gloved palm over the curve's far end and felt the modest glow returning from the jacket, heat that had been borrowed and was now being returned with a tip. He thought of the cup and did not allow the memory to look like sentiment. It was a diagram, plain and sufficient, crossing the border. The navigator said, voice careful. The map in his lap had grown fragile from use. The edges curled like winter leaves. They slid over the threshold of occupied air. The intercom went quieter without anyone asking it to. Mason's shoulders narrowed another degree, not in fear but in attention. The sky here had habits, flak corridors that stitched themselves between cloud banks, fighters that learned to wait in the seam where caution and duty wrestled, winds that turned promises into guesses. The sun should have been a kindness. Up here, it was a blade. At 20,000, the cold sharpened every thought. Hale felt the engine's vibration through the floor. Fine, even, like a violin string tuned to a single commandment, hold. He pictured the copper under the panel, the curve laid like a river bend between hard banks. He had never liked the poetry of machines. He liked their honesty. For once, both languages seemed to be saying the same thing. The first flak felt small, light scolds thrown from far away, annoyed punctuation in a sentence that had not yet found its angry verbs. Puffs marked the air in black stitches. The formation shifted half a degree. A flock deciding to accept the wind's suggestion without admitting it had been persuaded. A bomber 3 slots to starboard shed a thin ribbon of smoke, then found its breath again. On the intercom a voice said, minor, and nothing else. Words were a ration. The jacket held, the needle held. Hale wrote the times and then stopped writing because proof had become a luxury he could not spare attention for. He listened instead. To the pump's sigh, to the faint hiss of air along seams wound tight by careful hands, to the way men, when they are very afraid and very occupied, forget to perform courage and simply practice it. They reached the first turn. The wingtip lights bleached out in the sun. The horizon became a geometry problem solved at speed. Mason rode the throttles with fingers that had learned how not to scold metal. "Easy," he said into the mic, and the word carried down the aircraft like a blanket being passed to colder men. They stepped up to 22. The whisper returned, not as sound but as a possibility. Hale leaned over the engineer's shoulder and pointed to the bleed at the far end of the warm loop. The man cracked it a whisper. The needle thanked him by doing nothing dramatic. Somewhere aft, Ice thought about beginning and chose not to. Hale felt the curve's modest pride under his palm and allowed himself one breath through his nose that did not hurt. Cloud closed the world to a tunnel. They ran the white corridor steady and trusting, each crew seeing not the sky but the plane ahead, the way you sometimes see only the back of the man in front of you, and decide that is enough to keep walking. The navigator called a tiny correction, more ritual than need. The pilot obliged, the machine obeyed. They broke out into a hard blue that made everything cleaner and nothing kinder. The target lay a long hour away, with navigational fixes like stepping stones men had bled on yesterday. The radio whispered gossip from other wings, strictly functional. Icing reports, flak density, wind that lied. Through it all, the jacket kept its small sermon. Persuade, do not command. Dwell, do not dash. Keep talking to the line. A vibration went aught at the starboard inboard. Nothing dramatic. A burr added to the cord. The engineer's hand went to the panel. Hale was already there. He felt along the jacketed run, found the clamp he had worried about on the ground, and pressed the band with 2 fingers. The burr softened, as if reassured that someone was listening. He tapped the grease pencil mark faint even under metal and thought, absurdly, that the plane itself had remembered the instruction. 2 minutes to altitude step. The navigator said. "Copy," Mason answered. "We'll kiss 23 and behave while we're up there." They rose, the cabin temperature dropped another unkind inch. Breath became a private affair, a personal exchange between man and thin air that tolerated him rather than welcomed. Hale's knuckles ached under the glove where iodine had taught skin to be honest. He pressed his hand to the curve again and let the jacket answer with the same quiet warmth. He had built nothing romantic. He had built a habit of survival. The first real flak arrived like a season change. A wall ahead, uneven and ugly, a geography of hate built from mathematics and metal. The formation tightened without needing to be told. Mason's jaw set. His voice did not change. Eyes up. "We walk through it like a church," he said, and no one asked what he meant. It was enough. The shells flowered and unflowered, black blossoms whipped apart by wind. The ship bucked as air was struck near but not on. A dull boom pressed against the ribs. The right-hand plane stepped wrong for 1 second, then found the line again. Through it, the engines kept their stubborn hum. A farmer's tune hummed while he works. Hale watched the needle because watching it had become his confession and his absolution. It held. It held while noise tried to steal their attention, while light tried to glare conviction out of them, while cold tried to pull duty toward sleep. A voice broke into the net from another ship, thin with distance, frost inside window, minor. Another answered, jacket warm, pressure steady. The news travelled the way hope should, brief, factual, unadorned. They cleared the worst of it. The air went strangely empty after violence, the way a room feels after a shouting match, edges too sharp, quiet too loud. Mason let them have 3 degrees of gentleness and then took them back, lest anyone imagine the sky had converted. In the far distance, a smear hinted at the city that had learned to hate their arrival. The navigator's pencil clicked, just a small sound, the kind that says, "We will not improvise our way through this." Hale opened the logbook again, not to write but to look at the earlier words. The fence posts that had become a road. Transfer, coax, curve buys time. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He closed the book and rested it on his thigh like a steadying hand. A subtle change, so subtle that only men who had been flying too long would have felt it, ran through the ship. The engineer turned his head, puzzled. Mason's eyes flickered to the RPM and back to the sky. The hum had acquired grit, not a failure, a memory of one. Hale felt along the line again and found nothing out of place, then leaned into the panel and cracked the bleed a whisper. The grit sifted out of the note. The engine remembered how to be itself. He closed the bleed and touched the far curve, the jacket's exit, and felt the modest residue of warmth that meant the conversation was continuing as designed. He thought, with a kind of exhausted joy, that persuasion was winning where force would have failed. The intercom accented a word with static, fighters. The formation shifted its posture into that particular alertness you cannot fake. The first streak cut across the bright like a man writing his name on glass. The gunners flexed the old, necessary argument, lead and arc and patience. The fighters tasted them and peeled away, not yet committed. Flak resumed, smaller now, the stinging kind. The sky had decided to be a busy street with too many rules. Through it all, the jacket was not dramatic. It did its domestic miracle in darkness. They reached the initial point. The city unrolled to meet them with a geometry that had once been proud and would be again, but had chosen today to be dangerous. The bomb bay doors groaned. The plane's belly opened its cold mouth to the wind. The sudden drag pulled at everything. The engines tugged back like animals hitched to a heavy load. Hale slid his palm to the curve and thought of what it was about to be asked to do. Hold with the doors open to the winter of the world. On run, Mason said. His voice became narrower, a man balancing fine glass. Steady, steady. The bombardier rode the crosshairs through the city's angles. The pilot flew not by will, but by small, precise refusals to react. Hale watched the needle with the eyes you reserve for a child's second step. Flak climbed to meet them on habits and predictions, less a mind than a machinery of anger. The first fighter committed, the guns answered, some small shared pact between strangers, as old as war and as senseless, held them all to the rules of the moment. They were over it, over the place where the map ends in decision. The doors were open. The cold had rights in the room. The jacket's far end gave back its little warmth like a hand in a pocket that keeps a man decent through an unfair wind. Hale felt something in his chest unclench a single, careful notch. He did not confuse that feeling with safety. Bombs, away. The ship jumped lighter and meaner. The doors closed their teeth on the air. The engines felt the new arithmetic and sang it back with relief disguised as duty. The formation pivoted by inches. The city moved away as if offended. Flak continued because it had nothing else to do with itself. Hale finally let his eyes leave the gauge for longer than a breath. He looked at the men, at the navigator's pencil stilled mid-air, at the engineer's hands gentle on levers that could be cruel, at Mason's shoulders set to the exact angle where fear cannot find purchase. He felt the jacket's quiet breath against his glove and understood that the miracle, if there was one, would never be a shout. It would be the absence of a silence, the absence of engines dying into a soundless fall. They turned for home, weather weighted like a debt. The corridor they had used to come would not consent to be the same corridor going back. The navigator offered them a new one, thinner, fussier, threaded through airs that argued. The formation tightened again, metal trusting metal more than map. Hale kept his palm to the curve the way a father keeps his hand on the back of a chair where a child stands to see better. A burst sounded wrong, a short, impolite slap close to the starboard wing. The ship jerked, cursed, steadied. An odour pushed through the cabin sharp as pennies bitten, a hint of fuel where fuel should never be smelled. Hale's head snapped to the panel. The needle dipped a hair and recovered. He reached under the access lip and felt along the jacket, slow, patient, unafraid because fear makes hands stupid. At the far seam, no heat loss, no damp, he moved inboard. There, the slightest weeping, not from the curve, but from a joint upstream where the night crew had tightened to duty, and not to kindness. He pointed. The engineer's spanner found it, and asked the metal to be faithful. The weep became a memory. The needle apologized in the only way instruments can, by behaving. The wind turned spiteful. They stepped down to gentler air and found turbulence pretending to be mercy. The formation stretched and snapped back, elastic that had been used too often. A plane above them shivered as if insulted, and then steadied. The radio gave them a recited inventory of small damages now owned. A belly scar, a window gone to chalk, a tale that would talk about this later. No one listed anything as triumph. The sky does not care for that kind of language. Hale checked the curve for superstition's sake, and found only the same quiet conversation he had installed. He wrote a single word in the logbook because he had to put something of this into print, holding. They dropped under cloud, and the world grew edges again. Fields, roads, thin threads of river that glinted like sly promises. The men began to remember that bread could be hot, that beds had sheets, that laughter existed at volumes above a murmur. Even the plane's voice lowered from command to conversation. You could almost imagine the day had been a lesson and not a fight. Then the warning light blinked, tiny, insistent, easy to ignore if you had allowed relief a chair. The starboard inboard temperature spiked and settled, a man having second thoughts at a church door. The engineer's hand was there before thought finished. Hail cracked the bleed the width of a prayer. Heat found its easier path. The light steadied and then gave up. He felt the coil's far curve warm his glove one more time, modest as ever. He remembered the officers and their straightened line, the argument that had worn uniforms instead of sense, and he allowed himself one hard sentence, spoken only in his head, not today. The coast thinned into view like mercy. The formation loosened the way men loosen belts after funerals. Radio chatter grew recognizably human, names of towns that slept in safety, requests for headings with pleases smuggled into numbers, jokes with most of the edges filed off. The field called them home in a voice professional enough to trust and kind enough to be believed. Wheels down, flaps set. The runway stretched ahead like a verdict, and then like an absolution. Tires kissed. Brakes argued and then admitted. The ship settled into the old, ordinary gravity that made everything else possible. Engines idled like animals that have worked and now want water. They rolled to the hard stand. Men unstrapped the harness that had been spine for hours. Helmets came off. Faces had salt-dried into the seams. No one cheered. Relief applauds badly. It prefers to sit down. Mason stood, legs reminding him he owned them. He looked back through the narrow gap at Hale and didn't smile so much as soften. She held when the air wanted us. He said, "Your curve talked sense into a very unreasonable sky." Hale opened his palm, and the heat left in the glove felt like proof you don't have to argue with. He nodded once, because once was the right number. He touched the panel before stepping down the ladder and felt the plane's metal answer his knuckles with the dull, friendly note of a thing that has decided, for now, to be on your side. On the apron, the count began in the quiet math that makes hearts do ugly things. Dots on the horizon became planes, and planes became names, and names became nods or losses. Hale did not join the arithmetic out loud. He stood with his logbook under his arm and listened to the engines of those who had made it say the only prayer he knew, still running. He turned toward the hangar where the other jackets lay coiled like sleeping snakes, ready for their waking. He could taste copper and cold at the back of his throat, the flavors of a day spent persuading physics to be human. He thought of writing in the book and didn't. Some truths deserve a pause before paper. Far down the line, a plane came in low and late, one engine coughing, another muttering. Men moved without theatre. The ambulance rolled, then stopped, unneeded, then rolled again, this time to deliver a different kindness. Blankets, hands, hot mugs that pretended to be more than water and leaves. Hale lifted his pencil at last and wrote one line so small it could hide between the others. The hum stayed. He didn't know it yet, but as darkness pressed the cold back into corners and the field exhaled the day, the number everyone would arrive at in the mess counted and recounted, doubted and then believed, would be almost impossible. Not luck, not chance, 100 after 100 after 100, engines that should have faltered and did not. The curve's quiet argument, multiplied by copper and hands, would be the difference between a map full of black pins and a room still crowded with ordinary voices. And somewhere out over the water, one bomber nursed a wound no jacket could soothe, its pilot choosing between two bad altitudes while frost laced a window from the inside out. Proof that the sky was not finished yet, proof that the day's miracle would have to stretch a little farther before it could call itself complete. The horizon was pale and clean, a kind of forgiveness that came after too much noise. Smoke hung low over the English coast, drifting in ribbons that looked like exhausted sighs. One by one, the bombers returned, black silhouettes against a bruised sky. Their propellers cut through the air with the tired rhythm of men who had done what was asked of them and asked for nothing more. Arthur Hale stood at the edge of the runway with a clipboard he wasn't writing on. He counted shapes, not numbers. Each time a new shadow broke through the mist, he exhaled a little longer. Every engine that coughed and limped onto the field was a life preserved by something as small and foolish as a curve. K9 came in low and sure. Her landing lights blinked weakly, the fuselage streaked with soot and ice. Hale could see Mason in the cockpit, shoulders bowed, hands still steady. The tires kissed the tarmac and held. The plane rolled to a stop, the engines spinning down in a chorus of gratitude. No man dared interrupt. The crew climbed down slowly. Their faces were pale, their eyes too bright. Mason walked toward Hale, his steps uneven, boots scraping frost. He stopped a few feet away and pulled off his gloves. Engines held all the way. He said simply, "No freeze, not once." Hale nodded, his throat too tight for speech. Mason went on, voice lowering. "We lost 2 from the wing, but the rest. They made it. 200 planes across the line and back. Every one of them with your curve stitched into their bones." Hale looked past him, at the sky that had nearly eaten them whole. "It wasn't mine," he said. "It was the metal learning to be kind." Briggs joined them, his coat still buttoned, his eyes rimmed with the red of men who pretend they never worry. He clapped Hale on the shoulder, a soldier's praise, firm and fleeting. "Command wants your report before dark," he said. "They're calling this the cleanest run in months. No engine freezes, not one. The wind picked up, cold and salt, bitten." Hale didn't move. He watched as mechanics swarmed around K9, inspecting panels, tracing the copper veins hidden under the skin. Somewhere in that tangle of machinery, warmth still flowed, the ghost of a teacup's lesson. The day turned soft and grey. Crews drifted toward the mess hall, their laughter hesitant but real. The gramophone crackled to life, playing a tune that might have been jazz if you squinted at it. Hale sat at his bench again, the logbook open, the lamp burning low. He wrote slowly, carefully, each word weighed. April 14, 1943, 206 sorties returned, engine stable across all flights, jacketed lines functional, curved return verified at high altitude, no failures recorded. He paused, his pencil hovering over the page, then he added one more line. The hum stayed. He closed the book. Outside, the hangar door rattled against the wind. Briggs appeared in the doorway, his breath misting in the cold. "Arthur," he said, "they want you in ops." Hale followed him across the tarmac, his boots crunching through frost. The air smelled of fuel and victory, an uneasy perfume. The operations building was warm, too warm, the air thick with bodies and chatter. Officers leaned over maps, marking routes and erasing them. The room buzzed with restrained celebration. At the center stood the group commander, a heavy man with a heavy silence. He looked up as Hale entered. "You're the engineer," he said. "Yes, sir." The commander's gaze moved to the report Briggs handed him. He read, frowned, read again, so it worked. "Yes, sir. You did it with waste heat." "Yes, sir." Redirected through a copper jacket with a curved return. The commander grunted. "And it kept the lines clear the whole way. It persuaded them to." Hale said. The man's brow furrowed. Persuaded. Hale met his eyes. "Heat doesn't obey orders, sir. It listens. If you make the road right, it walks it willingly." A slow smile cracked the commander's face, like a man remembering warmth after months without it. "Well, keep it listening. You've just saved the 8th Air Force." There was no applause, no speeches. Just the sound of pencils scratching, orders being written, lives being scheduled. Hale left the room before anyone could thank him. Outside, the sky was bleeding into dusk. The hangar lights flickered on, pools of yellow in the grey. Mechanics worked with quiet purpose, their shadows long on the walls. Somewhere a kettle whistled. Hale found himself drawn to it, as if the sound alone could untie the day's knots. He poured the tea slowly, watching the steam curl upward. It caught the lamplight and made the air shimmer. For a moment the war felt far away. He lifted the cup to his lips and let the warmth settle inside him. The same warmth, he thought, that now pulsed through 200 bombers resting safely on the field. He set the cup down beside the coil on his bench. The copper gleamed in the low light, scarred but proud. He traced its edge with one finger, feeling the story hidden in the metal. The nights of solder and argument, the hours spent talking to heat, as if it were a child refusing sleep. Briggs walked in quietly. They're sending the design to every squadron by morning. He said, "You'll get a commendation." "I don't want one." Hale said. Briggs sighed. "I figured you'd say that, but you'll get it anyway." Hale nodded absently. "As long as the planes get it first." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the hangar roof. Then Briggs said, "You realize what this means. You changed how we fly. The curvet's more than a fix, it's a principle." Hale looked at the cup, at the line of steam curling along its rim. "Principles are only useful if they keep men alive," he said. Briggs gave a small, weary smile. "You've done that. That's enough." When he left, Hale remained by the bench, alone with the fading hum of the bass. He opened the logbook once more and read his earlier notes, the trail of thought that had led him here. Coke's heat, curve buys time, time buys flow, flow buys life. The handwriting wavered at the edges from exhaustion. He pressed a hand over the page as if to steady it. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, slow, indecisive. He watched it through the window, flakes catching in the light, melting before they reached the ground. For the first time in weeks, Hale let himself imagine sleep. Not the shallow kind that comes between alarms, but the kind that forgives. He turned off the lamp. The hangar sank into shadow, the copper curves glowing faintly as if remembering the warmth they carried. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back. The planes stood in their bays like sentinels, silent and massive, but alive. He thought of Mason's voice on the radio, calm amid the flak and frost. He thought of every man those engines had carried safely home. He whispered into the dark, "Hold fast, old friend, you've earned it." Then he stepped outside into the falling snow. The cold met him head on, but couldn't quite touch him. The airfield stretched before him, a plain of frost and firelight, where the sound of hammers had finally given way to the quiet of survival. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the world was still burning, but here, for one night, warmth had won. He didn't know it yet, but the victory of that morning would echo beyond the war. Years later, in hangars that smelled of new paint instead of cordite, young engineers would study the Hale curve, without knowing the man who invented it by accident, by exhaustion, by listening to a cup of tea. For now, though, Arthur Hale simply walked back to his bunk, carrying nothing but the silence of engines that refused to die. April 1943, 3 days after the clean run. The field woke slowly, like a house the storm had skipped. Frost still traced pale rims along the hangar doors, but the air no longer felt like a held breath about to break. Engines ticked in the distance, harmless, cooling themselves with the tidy satisfaction of tools that had done what they were made to do. Arthur Hale stood at the threshold with his hands inside his coat, and let the quiet come all the way into him. Inside, the bench waited exactly as he'd left it. Cup turned upside down to dry, logbook closed, pencil resting across it like a small gate barring entry to thoughts that didn't need thinking anymore. The copper coils on the rack held a low sheen, not proud, just clean, as if sleep had given them a face. He lifted the cup, set it right side up, and poured. Steam curled and found the rim the way a bird finds a thermal. It leaned, lingered, rose. Familiar. He didn't smile, he breathed. Outside, wheels rolled over puddled gravel with the patient rhythm of peacetime jobs, as if the base had put on a borrowed costume and decided to keep it for a morning. At 07:10, the post arrived with a sack that thumped down on the work table and scattered a new weather of paper. The corporal saluted, shrugged at his own formality, and left. Hale untied the cord and drew the letters out one by one. A few wore official skin, stamps, seals, the particular perfume of polished rooms. Most were clumsy envelopes, reused paper, edges softened by handling. Ink had run on some where fingers had been damp. He opened the first, a scrawl, almost defiant in its lack of schooling. Sir, you don't know me. I flew tail on J6. The engines sang today. I heard them sing all the way home. I'm writing because I don't know how to say thank you loud enough to reach you otherwise. He laid it beside the cup and opened the next. My boy wrote he could see his breath on the glass, but only on the outside this time. He said it like a joke, but I read the relief between the words. If your name belongs with the reason, accept a mother's gratitude, which is a difficult kind to refuse. No signature, only a pressed violet that had crumbled in the envelope and dusted the margin purple. He didn't rush, he read them in the order his hands chose, a navigator whose pencil no longer shook, a mechanic proud of a seam that had held, a chaplain who'd tightened a strap and discovered sermon in the turn of a wrench. He folded each paper back the way it wanted to be folded and slid it into the little tin box he had taken from a radio set, paint flaking, hinge stiff, perfect for holding what men said when they ran out of clever. By 0800, the light found its way into the hanger and made the chalk curve on the blackboard glow as if the board had swallowed a small sun and kept the secret. Hale wiped a film of dust from the bench and examined his knuckles. The skin had taken on that peculiar post, burn shine, polished by iodine and the boredom of healing. He flexed his hand and felt the pull of newness. He liked the honesty of it. Pain without drama, a calendar written on skin. Briggs appeared with a file and the look of a man obligated to bring news that was neither good nor bad but dressed to resemble both. Headquarters sent this, he said, laying down a single page before the rest. The paper carried a citation dense with perfect words, technical commendation. Hale read the paragraph once, then again, then let it lie. The colonel nudged it gently with a knuckle. There's also a note. He added, half smiling. They'd like to know if the device has a proper name. The men call it all sorts. Hale said, let them keep the names that work. Briggs inclined his head. I told them to file it under fuel heat, jacket, curved return. They'll ignore the curve in the title and keep it in the metal. That will have to be enough. He hesitated, then placed a second envelope on the table, small, hand-addressed, edges thumb, soft. From the infirmary. Inside, careful script, a nurse's hand. The crew from L2 asked me to pass this along. The engineer burned his palm helping with a clamp. He says the warmth he felt under the line will bring him back to the sky sooner than any praise. He also says the curve is pretty, and he is a man who does not use that word lightly. Hale looked down at the cup to steady the tenderness that sentence had let loose. Outside, a stretcher's wheels whispered past the open door, the sound too light to threaten. He followed it with his eyes and saw the ward windows bright in the thin sun, men inside propped up in beds, hands bandaged, faces scrubbed to the pale of clean pain. Someone had rigged a gramophone near the far sill. A needle found a tune and failed it elegantly. The men, smiling, did not mind. He went after breakfast, not as an engineer, not as a fixer, only as a man who owed some faces a visit. The ward smelled like disinfectant and wool and the sugar of tea that had cooled too fast. He knew none of their proper names and all of their kinds. The way a gunner holds himself like he's still balancing a line of sky in the sight. The way a pilot keeps his hands loose on blank. It's the way he keeps them loose on throttles. The way a radio man listens even to silence. You're the heat fellow, someone said, half accusation, half welcome. I'm the one who tried. Hale answered, they laughed, not hard, not to show off. He went bed to bed and didn't ask what hurt. He asked how long until boredom would become the worst of it. He took thanks like a man takes rain, without apology, knowing it fell on every surface without favour. One young face, freckled, heavy, lidded with sleep he needed but hadn't caught yet, held up a hand wrapped from palm to wrist. Would have been worse, he whispered, rueful and proud. The jacket burned me, means it stayed warm. Means it did, Hale said. He touched the air above the bandage, not quite making contact, as if blessing could travel without pressure. When he reached the end of the row, a captain with grey at the temples beckoned him closer and spoke without ceremony. I have a daughter who writes every Sunday, he said. This week I will have more to answer than yes, I'm here. I will have a 1, Sentence miracle that sounds like a small thing to outsiders. The hum stayed, you did that. Hale shook his head, we did that. Copper hands habit, I only taught a path. Back at the hangar, the day went on doing the mercies that only look small. Oil warmed without complaint. Tools returned to their pegs. A mop lay its stripe of clean down the workroom floor and made the air smell newly possible. A lorry backed up to the big door and left crates stenciled with numbers that meant copper had arrived from somewhere that had decided it could suffer cold, so another place could have heat. Hale signed the page and wrote a note of thanks to no one and to everyone. The afternoon brought visitors who meant well and didn't have time to turn meaning into manners. A young correspondent with a notebook too large for his pocket asked questions in bursts, eyes bright with the relief of good news. Did you think of it suddenly? He said, pencil ready. Was there a flash? Hale looked at the cup and felt the ache of the word suddenly. It came like weather, he said, felt in the bones before it was seen, no lightning, only persistence. The boy's pencil hesitated, then scrawled anyway. And what would you say to the men who fly with it? Nothing they don't know. Hale said, hold on to kindness wherever you find it. Sometimes it's copper. The boy blinked, smiled without quite understanding, and left, already translating mercy into copy. Briggs watched him go and shook his head, not unkind. They need heroes, he said. They have them. Hale answered, and it was not modesty, it was inventory. Toward evening the wind shifted and brought a scent that wasn't weather. Laundry starch, hot bread from the village, a neighbour sound to war that made the whole base lift its head and remember the world. Mechanics finished early what could not be finished and late what could not be rushed. Pilots drifted to the mess in pairs. The quartermaster declared a ration miracle and produced jam. The gramophone refused to die. Someone tuned it until the static softened, and a trumpet found its own name. Hale stayed at the bench because the bench felt like a kind of quiet many men were not afforded. He opened the tin, counted the letters without counting, and selected one that had been folded and refolded until the creases had become hinges. We heard your coil before we trusted it, it read. Then we trusted the word of the man who tightened it. You ought to know your invention weighs less than a name. We carried both. The first kept the engines, the second kept our nerve. He put that one back carefully. It rang a knock at the side door. The crew chief slipped in with a small brown parcel and the embarrassed look of a man carrying something that might be sentimental. This came with the copper. He said, box on top, no return. Hale opened it and found a teacup wrapped in newspaper, cracked twice and glued once. The repairs visible the way a healed bone is visible to the hand that broke it. Inside, someone had laid a brass button and a note the size of a matchbox. You don't know me. You saved me. I broke mine. Have this. He set the cup on the bench next to his own. The two of them sat there like old neighbours who had discovered their fences joined below the ground. He took the brass button and rolled it in his palm. It warmed there. He placed it on the logbook and let it shiny up the page. Twilight poured itself thinly across the field. Lamps woke in the windows one by one, soft squares of gold cut into the blue. Hale wiped the board clean and drew the curve again, not because it needed drawing, but because ritual shows gratitude without turning it into display. He wrote beneath it, almost too small to see. We asked nothing of heat it didn't want to give. We only gave it a reason. The door opened again, this time on Mason's. Scarf loose, hair still carrying the stubborn geometry of the headset. He leaned against the jamb, ease with edges. They're whispering your name at the mess, he said. I told them copper doesn't drink. Tell them copper is temperamental. Hale said, it will behave if you speak gently. Mason stepped in and picked up the new cup, turned it, tapped the rim, ugly as sin. He said, affectionate. Perfect, they were quiet. The silence between men who had survived the same day is its own language. Finally, Mason said, they'll give you a ribbon you won't wear. They'll put your name on a line no one reads. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when it disappoints. I'd trade it for a spare coil and a patient apprentice. Hale said, you'll have both. Mason set the cup down. One more thing. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a page creased into quarters. A letter from home, My wife says the line at the greengrocer was shorter by 3 minutes this week because the sirens are quieter. She says the quiet felt like a trick. I want her to believe it isn't. Hale nodded. We'll give her more weeks. Mason tightened his scarf. You can do that. I can teach the curve. Hale said. The rest is men and weather. When Mason had gone, the hangar felt big in the way churches do when you are the last to leave. The kettle clicked twice and forgot it had boiled. Hale washed the cup and set it beside the other, 2 arcs of white porcelain catching a scrap of lamplight and returning it with interest. He closed the logbook, laid his palm on the cover until the paper warmed, and thought of the men asleep already, and the men who couldn't sleep yet, and the men who were counting the breaths of others in rooms that smelled like bleach and breath. He blew out the lamp and let the dark collect. Outside, the wind ran a finger along the eaves and found nothing loose. The field made its long, low sound, the one you hear only when you've learned the difference between silence and peace. He stepped out and pulled the door behind him until the latch decided to agree. The sky above the runway was full of spent light and new stars. Far at the edge of sight, a train slid across the county with a sound like paper torn neatly in half. Somewhere a dog barked once and then remembered economy. Somewhere a bicycle bell tried out its friendliness on an empty lane. He walked toward the barracks, not hurrying, boots ticking a modest metronome on the pathway. He thought of the tin box and the violet dust and the brass button warming the page. He thought of a hand hovering over a bandage without touching and feeling, somehow, that contact had been made anyway. He thought of the curve as a drawing as metal as habit, and understood that what it purchased was not merely flow, not merely heat, but time. Time for a letter to arrive on Sunday, time for a laugh to outlast the tea, time for a man to tell another man he would be there tomorrow. At the barracks door, he paused and looked back at the line of hangars, at the low, dim stars of windows, at the patience of machines at rest. He touched the frame with the back of his hand, the old superstition he had grown too fond of to surrender. The wood answered with the cool of the evening, unconcerned with what it guarded. He went inside and lay down in the narrow bed that had learned the map of his shoulders. Sleep came without argument for once. He didn't dream of engines or metal or frost. He dreamt of the steam from a cup taking its time along a rim and disappearing into air that wanted it. He would wake before dawn to a new sack of letters and a memo that seemed to say less than it meant, redistribute personnel to advise neighbouring fields. He would stand in doorways that smelled like other men's days and teach the curve to hands that had learned different habits. He would take with him the little tin, the brass button, the 2 cups, one cracked, because memory keeps its own tools, and on a morning not far from now, he would open a logbook in a town that knew a different wind and write the same 2 words he had come to trust more than any citation. The weeks that followed were quieter, not peaceful. Nothing in war ever truly was, but gentler, as if the airfield had finally learned how to breathe between storms. The sound of engines still filled the mornings, but it was a different kind of noise now, confident, smooth, alive. Men who had once flinched at the first sign of frost now joked about it, as if the cold itself had been tamed. Arthur Hale walked among them with the slow gait of a man who'd earned fatigue instead of fleeing it. He wasn't saluted much, and he didn't mind. He preferred the nods, the wordless acknowledgments between those who understood that their survival had been a matter of inches and patience. Each morning began the same way. He'd unlock the hangar, step into the smell of oil and metal, and pour his tea. The steam would curl upward, tracing the same invisible geometry that had saved 200 lives. Some mornings he'd still catch himself staring at it, half expecting another revelation to rise with the vapor. But genius, he knew, rarely visited the same soul twice. On the second Monday after the Berlin run, a convoy rolled in from the neighbouring base. 2 trucks, a jeep, and a handful of engineers from elsewhere. They came to learn. The young lieutenant leading them had the sharp enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet seen failure up close. He shook Hale's hand firmly and said, We were told you solved the freezing issue, sir. We'd like to see how. Hale smiled faintly. Solved is a strong word. We persuaded it to be reasonable. The lieutenant blinked. Sir, physics. Hale said, moving toward the workbench. It doesn't take orders. It takes conversation. He laid out the copper jackets like a surgeon showing his instruments. Curved, tarnished, perfect. The men leaned in, their breath fogging the air as he traced the loop with a gloved hand. You'll be tempted to straighten it, he said. You'll think the bend wastes space, that the curve complicates the fitting. Don't. The curve gives heat time to learn what it's meant to do. Straight lines rush, curves listen. The lieutenant scribbled notes furiously, though he didn't yet understand half of what was said. Hale watched him and saw himself years ago. Young, certain that efficiency was always a virtue. By noon, the men were fitting coils under Hale's supervision. The hangar echoed with the clean music of wrenches and the soft hiss of torches. Hale moved from one to another, correcting hand angles, tightening clamps by touch rather than torque. Not too much force, he'd say, metal's like a good soldier. It obeys best when it's trusted, not bullied. By dusk, they had fitted 3 bombers. When the engines ran, the jackets glowed faintly in the low light, breathing warmth into the frigid air. Hale stood at the edge of the hangar, watching the frost recede from the panels. It was a small miracle, repeated, quiet and exact. That night, the mess hall was crowded. The laughter was louder now, the clatter of spoons against tin plates a kind of proof that hunger and hope could coexist. Mason joined Hale at a corner table, carrying 2 mugs of coffee so strong it smelled like defiance. You're a legend now, Mason said. Hale chuckled. Legends belong to the dead. I'm still repairing fuel lines. That's exactly why they talk about you, Mason replied. You did something none of us could have imagined, and you never asked for applause. Hale sipped his coffee. Because applause doesn't stop frost. Mason grinned. No, but it might stop despair. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, snow began to fall again. Gentle, almost beautiful in the lamplight. Somewhere near the back of the hall, someone started a song. The melody was rough, the lyrics half, forgotten, but it carried. Men who had flown through fire hummed along. Hale listened, his gaze drifting to the frosted window. For the first time he realized the sound no longer made him anxious. It was the sound of living, not of waiting. Later that evening, when most had gone to their bunks, Hale returned to the hangar. The night shift was small, 2 mechanics, a guard, and the hum of distant generators. The copper lines along the wall reflected the lamplight like veins of buried treasure. He took a seat at the bench and opened his logbook. Fuel heating system replicated successfully at outpost bases. Field efficiency improved, no further losses attributed to freezing. He stopped, tapping the pencil against the paper. Then he added a second note in smaller letters. Men still nervous, cold still cruel. Warmth still worth fighting for. He closed the book and set his pencil down. Across the hangar, the 2 teacups sat side by side. His and the cracked one a pilot had sent him. He picked up the latter, running his thumb over the fracture. It reminded him that even things broken could carry heat. He filled both cups from the kettle and let them sit in the lamplight. Steam rose from each, curling together in the air until it was impossible to tell which belonged to which. Outside, the world was still at war, but in that small pocket of England, between 2 cups and a curve of copper, something else had taken root. A lesson that wasn't written in any manual. That genius wasn't the lightning that struck, but the warmth that stayed. The next morning brought another letter. It arrived without ceremony, creased, smudged, folded 3 times over. The handwriting was neat but shaking. Hale opened it carefully. Sir, you don't know me, but I was on the raid to Hanover. Our engines didn't quit, though ice covered everything else. When I came home, my wife asked what saved us. I told her it was a man who looked at a cup of tea long enough to find mercy in it. Thank you. There was no signature, only an initial. Hale read it twice, then placed it in the tin with the others. He didn't notice the tear that had fallen until it darkened the edge of the paper. By evening, the sun set early again. Shadows stretched long across the field, the air humming with the low throb of idle engines. Hale stood by the hangar doors, hands deep in his coat pockets. Mason approached quietly. "They're saying this will be your last week here," Mason said. "Command wants you up north to teach the other units." "I suppose they're right," Hale said. "The cold doesn't stop at this field." Mason nodded. "You'll be missed." Hale turned, looking once more at the planes resting in their bays. "I'll miss them too. Machines remember you in their own way. They hold the shape of your hand longer than people do." Mason smiled faintly. "You've turned into a philosopher." "No," Hale said softly. "Just tired." That night, the hangar lights went out one by one, leaving only the faint orange glow of the heater. The wind pressed against the walls but couldn't get in. Hale sat with his cup, listening to the quiet creak of cooling metal, the slow breathing of sleeping machines. He thought of all the men whose names he'd never know, men who had flown through frost and flame and come home because a simple curve had convinced heat to stay a little longer. He thought of the letters, the laughter, the song in the mess. And then, without realizing it, he whispered into the dark, "We did it." No one answered, and that felt right. The silence was not empty. It was full of copper and courage and the hum that never stopped. He didn't know it yet, but the world beyond that airfield would move on without remembering his name. His invention would be simplified, standardized, stamped into manuals with no mention of teacups or late night realizations. But long after the war ended, every aircraft that crossed a winter sky would carry a trace of his thought, a quiet curve where warmth refused to die. And somewhere, in a museum decades later, that cracked cup would sit behind glass, its fracture catching the light, as if still holding the last breath of steam from that cold English morning. The year was 1972. A grey morning, pressed softly against the windows of a small county museum in Norfolk, where the air smelled faintly of old paper, brass polish, and time. In a back room labelled Aviation Innovations, World War Roman II, a young historian named David Collier brushed the dust off a box that hadn't been opened in decades. The label, written in fading blue pencil, read only, Fuel Line Project RAF Prototype Division. Inside were fragments, coil sketches, brittle carbon copies, a tin box dented along one corner, no medals, no citations, just a logbook, its pages yellowed and edges curled with the patience of 30 years. On the first page, beneath a set of neat technical diagrams, there was a single handwritten line. "We asked nothing of heat it didn't want to give. We only gave it a reason." A. H. Collier frowned. There was no further identification, no full name, no official seal. Yet every figure, every curve drawn in graphite, carried a precision that could not have belonged to chance. He set the book down gently, turned on the desk lamp, and began to read. The entries began in late February 1943, cold months, desperate months. Each page smelled faintly of paraffin and anxiety. Engines freezing mid-flight, thermodynamic imbalance suspected, must find path for warmth. Collier leaned closer, captivated. The handwriting changed over the weeks, sharper, faster, almost feverish. Sketches of copper coils filled the margins, annotated with equations and poetic asides, curves coax, lines command. Whoever A. H. was, he hadn't been just an engineer. He was something rarer, a man who believed that science and kindness were not opposites. Collier flipped further ahead. April 14, 1943. The entry that made him stop. 206 sorties returned, engines stable across all flights. The hum stayed. He read that line 3 times. It wasn't boastful. It was relief, written by a man who had learned to measure victory not in numbers, but in silence. The silence of engines that did not die. For the rest of that day, the historian read in reverent quiet. The words unfolded like a film spooling in his mind. An airfield waking in fog, men with soot on their faces, a solitary engineer drinking cold tea while physics bent to compassion. When the lights dimmed and the museum bell rang to close, Collier realized his eyes were burning. He looked again at the signature, A.H., a ghost of a name, swallowed by bureaucracy. Later that week, Collier took the logbook to the Imperial War Records Office in London. He waited for hours while clerks shuffled paper, the rhythm of bureaucracy unchanged since the war itself. Finally, an archivist in a beige cardigan lifted her eyes from the file. "Arthur Hale," she said, reading from a microfilm. "Squadron Engineer, 412th Bomber Command, East Anglia Division. Transferred May 1943 to instruct field installations across northern bases." She flipped another page, brow furrowing. "No service record beyond 1945. No commendation listed beyond a technical note of appreciation." She paused. "That's quite rare, considering what this log describes." Collier nodded. "Rare," he said quietly, "or forgotten." He left the building that day with photocopies tucked under his arm and a feeling that he was carrying someone else's unfinished story. 2 months later, in a tiny flat overlooking the Thames, Collier began writing. His desk was a battlefield of papers, letters from surviving pilots, declassified engineering notes, fragments of diaries written in pencil and oil stains. Each testimony said the same thing in a different tongue. Our engines never froze again. One pilot, retired Wing Commander Mason Atwell, then 84, had agreed to an interview. His voice trembled, but his memory was sharp as ever. "I remember him," Mason said, "quiet bloke, always smelled of solder and tea. While the rest of us cursed the cold, he listened to it. He told me once that heat and hope were the same thing. You just had to guide them through the right channel." He chuckled softly. "We called his fix the Teacup Trick. Thought he was mad, till it saved our skins." Collier leaned forward. "Did you ever see him after the war?" Mason shook his head. "No, he stayed behind when we demobbed. Said he'd had enough of noise. Bought a cottage near the coast, I heard. Never married, never wrote, just disappeared into the quiet he'd earned." There was a pause. Mason looked past Collier toward the window, his eyes catching the sunlight like glass. "He never wanted credit," he murmured, "but I think, deep down, he wanted to be remembered by the hum." Weeks turned into months as Collier pieced together Hale's forgotten legacy. The curve, the Hale return, as he began to call it, had not only saved engines during the war, its principle had lived on, buried beneath patents and paperwork, in the heating systems of modern aircraft and even passenger jets. Somewhere, in every engine that carried travelers safely across frozen skies, a trace of Hale's thought remained, the invisible kindness of warmth made mechanical. In 1973, Collier published a short paper titled "The Curved Line of Mercy, the Uncredited Genius of Arthur Hale." It barely made a ripple. A few aviation journals printed it between advertisements for propeller parts and veterans reunions. No awards, no headlines, but one reader, a curator at the RAF Memorial Museum, sent him a letter. "We have something that might belong to your Mr. Hale." The note read, "You should come see it." When Collier arrived, the curator led him through a corridor of glass cases filled with the ghosts of machines, altimeters, goggles, fragments of fuselage blackened by time. At the end of the hall stood a small, unassuming display. A single cracked teacup, faintly stained, sitting beside a coil of aged copper pipe mounted on wood. This, the curator said, was found in a storage crate labelled non-essential equipment, Hailsham Airfield. We thought it was scrap. Then your paper gave it context. Collier stared at it. The cup was ordinary, almost fragile in its humility. But the crack glowed faintly under the case light. A thin scar that had caught and kept the light, just as the metal curve beside it had caught and kept heat. He leaned closer to the small brass plaque beneath it. The teacup that taught heat to listen artifact recovered from RAF 4, 112th Bomber Command, 1943. Associated with uncredited engineer Arthur Hale, whose work on fuel line heat transfer saved over 200 Allied aircraft during the Second World War. The curator spoke quietly, as if not to disturb the air. "We don't know if that's the real cup he used, but somehow it feels like it remembers him." Collier smiled faintly. "So does the sky," he said. That evening, as the museum closed, Collier stood outside watching the sunset bleed over the London rooftops. A plane passed overhead, high and distant, its engines humming in even rhythm. He listened. The sound was smooth, constant, unwavering, alive. Somewhere, he thought, inside that aircraft, warmth was flowing along a quiet, curved path, a piece of mercy travelling through metal, a design born not from ambition, but from a man's refusal to let cold have the last word. He imagined Arthur Hale years ago, standing alone in the hangar at dawn, steam rising from his cup as the engines roared to life, the hum of machines blending with the hum of thought, a mind not seeking glory, only order, only understanding. And as the sound of the plane faded into the night, Collier whispered the words he'd read on the final page of the logbook, still etched into his memory, hold fast. He didn't know it then, but that phrase, two simple words written in pencil by a forgotten man, would become the title of his book, published years later and read by generations of engineers who never knew Arthur Hale's face. Each time they traced the curve of a pipe, each time they designed a system that coaxed rather than commanded, they unknowingly honored him. For in the end, Hale's greatest invention wasn't just the heat that stayed. It was the idea that even in war, compassion could be engineered. And somewhere in every steady hum that carried men safely home, his silence still spoke. The following winter, the museum placed Arthur Hale's exhibit in a new glass case, centered, illuminated, but still modest. It drew no crowds, no flash photography. Visitors would pause only briefly before moving on to the larger relics, the gleaming propeller, the bomber turret, the polished medals of men whose names filled history books. But every so often, someone would stop longer. They'd tilt their head, read the small inscription, and smile at the idea that a cracked teacup could save lives. Those were the people who lingered, the engineers, the dreamers, the quiet ones who understood that the smallest ideas often carried the longest echoes. Outside, snow had started to fall over London again. It gathered softly along the museum windows, diffusing the light into something almost holy. Inside, the copper coil reflected it faintly, the same way frost had once shimmered against its warmth. At that same hour, far north along the coast of Norfolk, a cottage sat at the edge of the sea, weather, beaten, slate, roofed, its windows facing the grey tide. Inside, time had done what it always does. It erased the urgency, but not the memory. A local postman, sorting his evening mail, still recalled the man who used to live there decades ago. Quiet chap, he'd told a journalist once, wrote letters to no one, mostly worked in his shed, always smelled faintly of oil and tea. Arthur Hale had died in that cottage sometime in the mid-1950s, alone but not lonely. The neighbours said the light in his workshop never went out. When they finally opened the door, they found his workbench perfectly ordered, drawings pinned to the wall, each curve measured in soft pencil. The last line written on the board in faded chalk read, "Nothing straight holds warmth for long." No one understood it then. Now, decades later, that line became the epigraph of Collier's book. When Hold Fast, the forgotten genius of Arthur Hale was published, it sold modestly but steadily. Engineers passed it to one another. Pilots kept copies in their offices, under stacks of manuals. Teachers read passages aloud to students learning not just about aerodynamics, but about humanity inside invention. Collier never grew tired of the letters he received. They came from people who had never known war, yet somehow felt they knew the man. "I design heating systems for Arctic stations," one wrote. "Every curve I draw now feels like a conversation with him." Another came from a retired pilot. "I flew with the hum, though I never knew who gave it to me. Now I do." Somewhere, Hale's story had become more than a tale of one man's ingenuity. It had become a quiet anthem for persistence, for decency, for the idea that brilliance doesn't always shout. In 1981, Collier received a letter printed on crisp government stationery. It bore the crest of the Royal Air Force Historical Committee. "Dear Mr. Collier," it began, "following your publication and subsequent verification by surviving records, we are pleased to inform you that the Ministry of Defence has approved posthumous recognition for Engineer Arthur Hale, RAF 4, 112th Squadron, for exceptional technical service to the Allied Air Command during World War II. The commendation will be displayed at the Imperial War Museum alongside the artifacts credited to his design. At the bottom, beneath a long list of bureaucratic signatures, was one line in bold, for his ingenuity and for the lives saved by his mind. Collier smiled when he read it, not because it was overdue, but because it was inevitable. History, like heat, simply needed time to reach the right places. The following spring, the dedication ceremony took place in a small hall inside the museum. No grand speeches, no television cameras, just a few veterans, a handful of engineers, and a chair reserved for a man who'd never needed applause. Mason Atwell's son attended in his father's place, wearing his old service jacket. When the curator unveiled the plaque, he read aloud the words engraved in brass. Arthur Hale, 1905-1956, Squadron Engineer, RAF 4, 112th Bomber Command, inventor of the curved return fuel heating system, which preserved engine function during high-altitude operations and saved the lives of over 200 Allied airmen. His legacy reminds us that even in war, warmth can be engineered. The hall remained still. Then from somewhere in the back a voice broke the silence. The hum stayed. It said softly. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. A few veterans smiled. The words had outlived the man who wrote them. After the ceremony, Collier stayed behind long after everyone else had gone. Hall was dim now, lit only by the soft light above Hale's plaque. He stood there quietly, the way one does at the end of a story that doesn't really end. He thought of that logbook, the cramped handwriting, the small moral truths woven between the equations. He thought of Hale's burned hands, cold air of the hangar, the endless nights of trial and error. What kind of man, Collier wondered, discovers salvation inside a teacup? He smiled faintly, hearing Hale's imagined voice in his mind. A man who was cold enough to notice warmth. The next morning, Collier took a train north, to Norfolk, to find the cottage Hale had once called home. The landscape rolled by in muted greens and browns, the same colour palette Hale would have known, hedgerows, wet fields, the distant sea flashing silver. When he reached the village, he found the place easily. Locals had kept it as a kind of quiet shrine. The door creaked, the hinges patient. Inside, dust motes turned slowly in the sunlight that leaked through the window. On the workbench lay the ghost of a life, rusted tools, old drafts, and a final cup, still sitting where Hale must have last set it down. The crack down its side had darkened, but the rim still caught the light. Collier stood there for a long time, his breath the only thing moving. The wind outside hummed faintly through the cracks of the old wooden frame, sounding, for a moment, like an engine at idle. He closed his eyes and let the sound fill the room. For one fleeting instant, it was 1943 again. The hangar was alive, the jackets glowing, the men laughing under clouds of frost, and Hale stood among them, sleeves rolled, cups steaming, eyes steady with the calm of a man who had found his answer not in glory, but in grace. Collier left the cottage as the tide began to rise. The sea lapped at the rocks with the same rhythm that had once guided those engines across frozen skies. He turned back for one last look at the window, where sunlight caught the glass just so, making it seem as though a lamp still burned within. Back in London, as dusk settled over the city, the museum lights flickered on. In the hall of quiet artifacts, the teacup glowed under its case, the copper curve beside it gleaming like a line drawn between past and present. And somewhere high above, invisible in the night, a passenger jet cut across the clouds, its engines purred steady and sure, carrying warmth through air colder than thought. If you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the faint, even hum that had once meant life. Arthur Hale never asked for remembrance, but he left it everywhere, in the heat that refused to leave, in the machines that carried men home, in every engineer who still believes that the smallest act of understanding can change the course of history, because it wasn't luck that saved them that winter. It wasn't command or chance or even courage. It was genius, the kind born not from ambition, but from desperation, and in every warm breath of every engine that ever faced the cold, Arthur Hale still lives. If this story moved you, give it a like so others can find these forgotten tales of wartime brilliance, and subscribe. There are many more stories of human genius waiting to be told.